Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day's still hanging around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Where are you listening from tonight, I wonder? I hope you found somewhere comfortable, somewhere you can let your thoughts settle and drift. Tonight, we're going to a hilltop, a quiet place in southeastern Turkey, not far from the Syrian border, a place most people have never heard of, though it changes everything we thought we knew about our ancestors, about when civilization began, about what humans were capable of long before they planted the first seeds or built the first cities. There's a temple there, the oldest temple ever found, older than the pyramids by 6,000 years, older than Stonehenge, older than pottery, older than writing, older than farming itself. It was built by people who weren't supposed to be capable of building anything at all. Hunter-gatherers, nomads, people who moved with the seasons, following herds, gathering wild plants, living in temporary camps. And yet they built this. Massive stone pillars carved with animals and symbols, circular enclosures arranged with precision, a monument that required hundreds, maybe thousands of people working together over generations. We're going to explore Göbekli Tepe. If you're inclined, a like or subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might need it. Now settle in. Feel whatever's around you. The warmth, the weight of the evening, the surface beneath you. Let your breath slow. There's no rush tonight. We have hours together, and we're going to move slowly through time. Deep time. The kind that makes everything feel both impossibly distant and strangely close. Picture this if you can. Imagine standing on a limestone ridge in what's now Turkey. The air is warm and dry. The wind carries the scent of wild grasses and dust. Below you, a plain stretches toward distant mountains, and around you, rising from the earth like the ribs of some ancient beast, are stones. Massive T-shaped pillars, taller than a person, some much taller, carved with creatures that no longer roam these hills, foxes and lions, scorpions and vultures, snakes coiling around stone. These pillars were raised 11,000 years ago. 11,000 years. Think about that number for a moment. All of recorded history, everything from the first Egyptian dynasties to this very night, fits into the last 5,000 years. This place is more than twice that old. The people who built it left no writing, no cities, no pottery bearing their marks. Just these stones, buried deliberately, preserved by chance, waiting in silence until a shepherd noticed something strange in his field in 1963. What were they thinking, those ancient builders? What did this place mean to them? Why invest so much effort, so much coordinated human labour in a structure that wasn't a house, wasn't a fortress, wasn't anything practical at all? We don't know, not entirely. But we know some things, we've learned some things, and the rest, well, the rest we can wonder about together. The mystery starts long before the stones were raised. It starts in a world we can barely imagine. A world at the end of the Ice Age, when everything was changing, when the climate was shifting, when wild grains were beginning to grow thick enough to gather, when humans were standing at a threshold they didn't even know existed. So let's go back, not just centuries, but millennia, back to a world before temples, before agriculture, before the long, slow march toward what we call civilization. Back to the moment when something changed, when people who had wandered for tens of thousands of years decided to stop, to gather, to build something that would outlast them all. Take a breath. The story begins in the cold, long before anyone thought to plant a seed, long before the first grain was stored or the first animal penned. The world was cold. Not everywhere, not all the time, but cold enough. The Ice Age hadn't quite released its grip on the northern latitudes. Glaciers still covered much of Europe and North America, vast sheets of ice miles thick, pressing down on the Earth with the weight of continents. The climate fluctuated, warming and cooling in cycles that lasted centuries. And around 10,800 BCE, just as things seemed to be warming, just as the glaciers were beginning their slow retreat, the cold returned. Suddenly, dramatically. They call it the Younger Dryas, a geological period named after an Arctic flower that spread south during this final cold snap. It lasted roughly 100-200 years. Temperatures plummeted. Rainfall patterns shifted. The slow greening that had begun during the previous warm period reversed. In some places, forests died back. Grasslands withered. The herds that humans had followed for millennia moved, adapted, or disappeared. But not everywhere froze. The Fertile Crescent, that arc, of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and up into the Levant and southern Anatolia, remained temperate. Cooler than before, perhaps, drier in some areas, but livable. Hospitable to the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, to gazelle and aurochs, to the people who hunted them. Imagine standing there, in what would one day be southeastern Turkey. The year is something like 10,000 BCE. The landscape rolls in gentle hills and limestone ridges. To the north, the Taurus Mountains catch clouds and force them to release their rain. To the south, the land opens toward the plains of northern Syria. Rivers cut through the terrain, the Euphrates not far away, fed by snowmelt and springs. The air smells of dust and wild grasses. Maybe it's spring. Maybe the brief rains have coaxed green from the rocky soil, and wildflowers dot the hillsides. The sky is immense, unbroken by buildings or roads or any human mark. At night the stars are so bright they cast shadows. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of light, and the people, perhaps you see them. A small band, maybe 20 or 30 individuals. They move through the landscape with a knowledge we've lost, knowing which plants are edible, which animals are near, where water flows beneath the surface. They carry what they need, stone tools, baskets woven from grass, animal hides for shelter. Everything they own can be packed and moved in a day. They're not primitive. That's important to understand. Their brains are the same as ours. Their capacity for language, for abstract thought, for creativity, identical. They've been making art for tens of thousands of years already, carving figurines, painting on stone, creating music with bone flutes. They bury their dead with ceremony, suggesting belief in something beyond the physical. They have stories, myths, explanations for the world they see around them. But they don't farm. Not yet. They don't need to. The land provides wild wheat and barley. Grow thick in certain areas, dense enough to harvest with stone sickles. Herds of gazelle migrate through on predictable routes. There are wild sheep, wild goats, wild cattle. Aurochs, massive and dangerous, but huntable with cooperation and skill. There are birds, fish in the rivers, nuts and fruits in season. Life is hard. Don't romanticize it. Infant mortality is high. Injuries that we'd consider minor can be fatal. Weather, predators, accidents, disease, all take their toll. But there's also freedom, mobility, the rhythm of following the seasons, of knowing the land intimately because your survival depends on it. Perhaps they gather in certain places where the hunting is particularly good, where multiple bands might meet, places where marriages are arranged, where stories are shared, where knowledge is passed between groups. These gatherings are temporary, a few weeks maybe. Then everyone disperses again, moving on to the next camp the next season. But something is changing, slowly, imperceptibly at first. The Younger Dryas is ending. Around 9600 BCE, the climate begins to warm again. The cold retreats for good this time. Rainfall increases. The wild grasses that humans have been harvesting for millennia begin to thrive. They grow denser, more abundant. The herds increase too, feeding on the expanding grasslands. And perhaps, some people begin to linger. To return to the same places year after year. To notice that spilled grain from one harvest grows the next season. To observe that certain plants, when encouraged, produce more abundantly. The seeds of agriculture are being planted, though not literally. Not yet. These are still hunter-gatherers, still mobile, still living in what archaeologists call the Epipaleolithic, the final phase of the Stone Age before farming changes everything. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars their ancestors watched, the same stars we see now. The constellations haven't changed. Orion still hunts, across the winter sky. The Pleiades still cluster like scattered seeds. The North Star, though it's not quite the North Star yet, the Earth's axis has shifted slightly over 11,000 years, still marks direction for those who know to look. They watch those stars. They must have. Humans have always watched the sky. It's how we navigate, how we track seasons, how we mark time when there are no calendars or clocks. The patterns up there reflect the patterns down here. When certain stars appear on the horizon at dusk, it's time to move to the summer hunting grounds. When others rise, it's time to harvest the wild grain. The people living in this late Ice Age world have all the cognitive tools they'll need for what comes next. They just don't know it yet. They don't know that within a few centuries some of them will do something unprecedented. They'll gather in numbers never seen before. They'll quarry stones weighing tons. They'll carve symbols and raise pillars and create something that serves no practical purpose at all, something purely for meaning, for ritual, for connecting the earth to the sky. But first the world has to finish warming. The landscape has to stabilise. The abundance has to increase to the point where people can afford to spend time on something other than immediate survival. The stage is being set. The pieces are moving into position. And on a particular hilltop, on a limestone ridge overlooking a fertile plain, something waits. Not built yet, not even imagined yet, but waiting nonetheless the way all futures wait in the seeds of the present. The cold age is ending. The warm age is beginning, and with it, everything will change. Picture a life without walls, without doors, without the weight of a roof over your head every night. This is how humans lived for most of our existence. Mobile, nomadic, following the food, following the seasons, following patterns learned and refined over thousands of generations. We think of this as primitive, maybe. We imagine hardship and deprivation. And there was hardship, make no mistake. But there was also a kind of freedom we can barely comprehend now, locked as we are into mortgages and property lines and permanent addresses. The hunter-gatherers of the late Epipaleolithic, the people living in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE, moved in seasonal rounds, not aimlessly, not desperately. They knew the landscape the way we know our homes. They knew where the wild almonds ripened in early summer. They knew which valleys the gazelle herds would cross during their autumn migrations. They knew where to find flint for tools, where to find ochre for pigment, where springs bubbled up even in the driest months. A typical band might consist of 20 to 50 people, extended families mostly, children, adults, elders. Everyone had roles. The young learned by watching, by doing. There were no schools, no formal education, just apprenticeship into survival. How to track animals, how to identify edible plants, how to knap flint into sharp blades, how to tan hides, how to find water, how to read the sky. They travelled light. Everything they owned had to be carried. Stone tools, essential, carefully made, often beautiful in their functionality. Baskets woven from reeds or grass, animal skin bags for carrying food, for holding water, hides for clothing, for shelter, bone needles for sewing. Maybe a few personal ornaments, a shell from the distant coast, a carved piece of bone, something that marked identity or status or simply beauty. Their camps were temporary, a few days, maybe a few weeks in a particularly abundant spot. They'd build simple shelters, frames of wood or bone covered with hides. They'd kindle fires, cook meals, tell stories. The old would speak of the past, of the land's rhythms, of where to go and when. The young would listen. This is how knowledge survived without writing. Through memory, through oral tradition, through the patient, repetition of essential information. And they buried their dead. This is important. This tells us something about their inner lives. They didn't just abandon bodies. They dug graves, often shallow but deliberate. They placed the dead in specific positions, curled up, as if sleeping. They included grave goods, tools, ornaments, ochre powder. This suggests belief in an afterlife, or at least a sense that the dead deserved care, that death was a transition rather than an ending. Maybe they believed in spirits. Maybe they saw the world as alive with forces beyond the visible. Animism, anthropologists call it. The belief that animals, plants, rivers, mountains all possess some kind of consciousness or soul. It makes sense for people living so intimately with nature. When your survival depends on the movements of herds, on the fruiting of trees, on the flow of water, you pay attention. You develop relationships. You show respect. Perhaps they had shamans, individuals who could mediate between the human world and the spirit world. People who entered trance states, who interpreted dreams, who performed rituals to ensure successful hunts, or healthy births, or protection from danger. We find evidence of ritual behaviour in the archaeological record, carefully arranged stones, unusual burials, objects that seem to have symbolic rather than practical purpose. They made art. This isn't speculation. We know this. They carved small figurines from stone and bone. They engraved symbols on rocks. They created music. Bone flutes have been found, ancient beyond imagining. still capable of producing sound. Art isn't a luxury for these people. It's part of being human. It's how they expressed identity, belief, connection to something larger than themselves. Their diet was varied. More varied, probably, than ours. Wild wheat and barley, yes, gathered with stone sickles when the grain was ripe, pounded into flour with stone mortars, wild legumes, nuts, pistachios, almonds, fruits, in season, and meat, gazelle primarily in this region. But also wild sheep, wild goats, wild pigs, birds, fish, whatever could be hunted or trapped. They were healthy, relatively speaking. Skeletal remains show they were taller on average than the farmers who would come later. Their teeth, while worn from grain ground with stone, were relatively free of cavities. The sugar-rich diet that rots teeth wouldn't arrive until much later. They died younger than we do, of course. No antibiotics, no surgery, no modern medicine. But those who survived childhood often lived into their 40s or 50s, some even longer. Take a breath here. Let that image settle. Humans living this way for tens of thousands of years, generation after generation after generation, following the same patterns, telling the same stories, moving through the same landscapes, not unchanging. Culture evolves, tools improve, populations shift, but stable, sustainable. A way of life that worked, and yet something was stirring. Some restlessness. Some impulse toward complexity that we can barely trace in the archaeological record, but that must have been building. Because within a few centuries of the time we're imagining, these mobile hunter-gatherers would do something extraordinary. They would gather in unprecedented numbers. They would commit to a project that required coordination and planning and sustained effort over generations. They would build Göbekli Tepe. Why? What changed? What need arose that couldn't be met by the traditional patterns? Was it spiritual? A new form of belief demanding new forms of expression? Was it social? Groups growing larger, needing new ways to bind themselves together? Was it environmental? The changing climate creating new opportunities, new challenges? We don't know, not certainly, but we can see the ingredients assembling, the climate warming, the wild grasses growing more abundant, the herds increasing, the population slowly expanding, and perhaps most importantly, the cognitive capacity, always there, always present, beginning to express itself in new ways. The stars still wheeled overhead, the same stars. But maybe people were beginning to watch them differently, to see patterns not just for navigation or seasonal markers, but for meaning, for connection to the eternal, for answers to questions that had no obvious practical utility. Where do we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? These are the questions that drive monument building. These are the questions that would transform a hilltop in Anatolia into the world's oldest temple. But first, the wandering continues. The old patterns persist. For now. For a little while longer. Until the moment when everything changes and the wandering people decide to stop, to gather, to build something that will last far longer than any camp, any season, any single human life. The world is ready. The people are ready. The stone waits in the hills, patient and unknowing, and somewhere, the future is already beginning. There are places that feel different. You know this. You've felt it. A church, maybe, even if you're not religious. A battlefield, a graveyard, a mountaintop. Places where the air seems to hold something. Memory, maybe, or meaning, or just the accumulated weight of human attention. This hilltop was one of those places, long before anyone carved a single stone, long before the first pillar was raised. It was already significant. It must have been. Because you don't choose a random spot for something as monumental as what would be built here. You choose a place that already matters, a place that calls to you. The location is called Göbekli Tepe now. In Turkish, that means Potbelly Hill, a prosaic name for an extraordinary place. It's in southeastern Turkey, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa, not far from the Syrian border. The landscape is semi-arid now, dry, rocky, dotted with scrubby vegetation, hot in summer, cool in winter, with most rain falling between November and March. But 11,000 years ago it was different, greener, more fertile. The Younger Dryas cold period was ending, and the warming climate brought increased rainfall. The hills supported more vegetation. The plains below teemed with wildlife. This was prime territory for hunter-gatherers, Abundant resources, diverse ecosystems, strategic vantage points. The hill itself is limestone. Ancient limestone formed hundreds of millions of years ago from the compressed remains of marine organisms when this entire region lay beneath a shallow sea. The same geological process that created the limestone also made it perfect for carving. It's relatively soft, workable with stone tools, and it's everywhere. The whole region is limestone, hills and ridges and outcrops all waiting to be shaped. From the top of this particular ridge, you can see for miles. To the south, the Harran Plains stretches flat and vast. To the north, the land rises toward the Taurus Mountains. Water flows through the landscape, springs and streams feeding into the Euphrates system. This is a natural crossroads, a place where different environments meet, where different groups of people might encounter each other. Perhaps that's why it mattered. Perhaps this was already a gathering place, a neutral ground where different bands met to trade, to exchange information, to arrange marriages that would bind separate groups into larger networks. These gatherings are known from ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers. They serve essential social functions, preventing inbreeding, sharing knowledge, resolving conflicts, celebrating together. Imagine it. Early autumn, maybe. The summer heat has broken. The first rains have greened the landscape, and from different directions, following different paths, people converge on this hill. They bring things to trade: obsidian from volcanoes to the north, shells from the Mediterranean coast, animal hides, dried, meat, baskets of wild grain. They bring news, where the herds are moving, where water is plentiful, what other groups are doing, and they bring their stories, their myths, their explanations for the world. Perhaps different groups have different versions. Perhaps they argue, compare, merge their beliefs. Perhaps a shared mythology begins to form, a common understanding of the sacred. The hill witnesses all of this, silent, patient, the limestone warming in the sun, cooling at night, the wind moving across its crest, carrying seeds and dust and the sounds of human voices, the stars wheeling overhead, night after night after night, marking time in their slow celestial dance. Wild animals move through this landscape too, gazelle in vast herds during migration season. Aurochs, those massive wild cattle, dangerous and majestic. Wild sheep picking their way across the rocky slopes. Foxes hunting at twilight. Snakes sunning themselves on warm stones. Scorpions hiding in crevices. Vultures circling on updrafts, watching for carrion. Lions. Yes, lions once roamed this region, though they're long gone now. These animals matter, not just as food, though they're that too, but as symbols, as totems, as beings that occupy the same world but live by different rules, that possess qualities humans might admire or fear. The lion's strength, the fox's cunning, the vulture's connection to death and transformation, the snake's ability to shed its skin and renew itself. Perhaps certain animals were already associated with certain groups. Clan totems, anthropologists call them, ways of marking identity, of claiming lineage, of explaining relationships. We are the people of the fox. We are the children of the wild boar. These identifications create bonds within groups and distinctions between them. They give structure to society without requiring written laws or formal institutions. The limestone waits. The seasons turn. The people come and go, leaving traces we can barely detect. A few stone tools dropped and forgotten, a fire pit filled with charred bone and ash, a shallow grave dug and covered. Nothing permanent, nothing meant to last. Just the ephemera of lives lived lightly on the land. But something is building. Some need, some vision, some shared understanding that something more is required. The gatherings on this hill become more frequent, perhaps, more important. The rituals performed here become more elaborate. The stories told here become more central to identity and meaning. And then, maybe gradually, maybe suddenly, someone has an idea. Or perhaps it's not one person, but a collective realization emerging over years or decades. What if we built something? What if we took this stone, this patient limestone that surrounds us, and shaped it? What if we raised pillars to mark this place, to honour the spirits or ancestors or gods we believe dwell here? What if we created something permanent, something that would outlast our brief lives and anchor our people to this sacred ground? It's a revolutionary idea. Humans have been making things for hundreds of thousands of years. Tools, shelters, clothing, art, but not monuments, not architecture meant to endure. Why would nomadic people build something they'd have to leave behind when the seasons changed? And yet the idea takes root, takes hold, becomes shared vision, becomes collective purpose, becomes the thing that will transform this quiet hilltop into a site that will astonish archaeologists 11,000 years later. The stone waits. The hill waits. The future waits, curled up in the present like a seed in dry ground, ready to germinate when conditions align. And very soon now, in the grand sweep of time, impossibly soon, those conditions will align. The wandering will pause, the gathering will begin, and the first stones will be cut from the living rock, shaped with patient effort, and raised toward the sky that has watched over this place since long before humans walked the earth. The silence before creation is ending. The hilltop is about to wake. For thousands of years the hilltop kept its secret, buried, silent, waiting under soil and grass and the footsteps of people who had no idea what lay beneath them. The site wasn't completely forgotten. Local farmers knew there was something odd about this particular hill. When they ploughed their fields, the plough sometimes struck stone, worked stone, carved stone. Not natural bedrock, but something shaped by human hands. They called it a cemetery, assumed it was medieval. Old, yes, but nothing exceptional. Nothing that would rewrite the history of civilization. In 1963, a shepherd was moving his flock across the hilltop. Maybe it was spring. Maybe the winter rains had washed away some of the soil. He noticed something protruding from the ground. A stone. But not just any stone. This one had a shape. Deliberate. Unnatural. He mentioned it to others. Word spread, the way news spreads in rural communities. Someone reported it to authorities. An American team from the University of Chicago surveyed the site briefly in the 1960s. They saw the stones. They noted the location. But they dismissed it as a Byzantine cemetery, maybe 1,000 years old. Interesting locally, perhaps, but not worthy of major excavation. They moved on. The hill returned to silence. For 30 years, nothing happened. The stones waited under the soil. Sheep grazed above them. The seasons turned. And the secret held. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived. He was working on a survey of the region, cataloguing Neolithic sites. Someone mentioned the odd cemetery on the hilltop. Schmidt decided to take a look, just a cursory visit, just to confirm what the earlier team had concluded. But when he reached the site, when he saw the stones emerging from the soil, something clicked. The shape was wrong for a cemetery. The style was wrong. Everything about it felt older, stranger, more significant than anyone had realized. Schmidt was an expert on the pre-pottery Neolithic, the period in the Near East before pottery was invented, when agriculture was just beginning. He'd spent years studying sites from this era. He recognized what he was seeing. These weren't medieval grave markers. These were something far older, far more extraordinary. He began excavating, carefully, methodically, using the slow, patient techniques of modern archaeology, trowels and brushes, photography and measurement, layer by layer revealing what had been hidden. And what emerged from the earth was astonishing, impossible almost, the kind of discovery that makes you question everything you thought you knew. T-shaped pillars, massive limestone pillars carved into a distinctive T-shape, like a human form abstracted to its most basic geometry. Some were still standing upright where they'd been placed 11,000 years ago. Others had toppled or been deliberately laid down, but their presence was undeniable. Their craftsmanship was extraordinary, and their age, when the first carbon dates came back, was staggering. 9600 BCE. That's what the radiocarbon analysis suggested for the earliest phases. The oldest layers of construction at Göbekli Tepe dated to around 9600 to 9200 BCE. Later phases continued until around 8200 BCE, but that earliest date, 9600 BCE, meant this site was roughly 11,600 years old. Let that settle for a moment. 11,600 years. Older than the first cities of Mesopotamia by 6,000 years. Older than the invention of pottery. Older than agriculture by any traditional timeline. This was supposed to be a period when humans were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, still living in temporary camps, still millennia away from building anything permanent. And yet here was monumental architecture, sophisticated stone carving, evidence of organised labour on a massive scale, all created by people who, according to the textbooks, shouldn't have been capable of it. The stones themselves tell part of the story. They're limestone, quarried from the ridge itself. You can still see the quarry nearby, a depression in the bedrock where pillars were cut and shaped before being transported to the enclosures. Some of these pillars are enormous, 5 metres tall, 6 metres, weighing 10, 15, 20 tons, maybe more. If you could touch one, and you can if you visit, you'd feel the limestone's texture, smooth in places where it was carefully worked, rough in others where tool marks are still visible, cool to the touch, even in the midday heat, because stone holds the night's chill longer than air. Solid, dense, heavy with time. The pillars are arranged in circles, enclosures, archaeologists call them. Roughly circular spaces defined by a ring of smaller pillars surrounding 2 larger central pillars. The central ones are always oriented the same way, always positioned as a pair like twins or guardians or gates. Around them, the ring of smaller pillars creates a boundary, a defined space set apart from the ordinary world. Schmidt's team uncovered multiple enclosures. They used ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing techniques to map what still lay beneath the surface. The results were stunning. At least 20 circular enclosures exist on this hilltop, maybe more, and the team has excavated only a small fraction, maybe 5% of the total site. Most of Göbekli Tepe still lies buried, protected now under soil and careful archaeological practice, waiting for future generations with better tools, better techniques, better questions. The stones are patient. They've waited this long. They can wait longer. But what has been revealed already is enough to transform our understanding of the Neolithic revolution. This wasn't a simple progression from nomadic to settled, from hunting to farming, from small bands to complex societies. Something else was happening, something more nuanced, more mysterious. Perhaps ritual came before agriculture. Perhaps the need to gather, to build sacred spaces, to mark meaning in stone. Perhaps that impulse drove people to create the surplus needed to feed the workers. Perhaps religion built civilization, not the other way around. Schmidt believed this. He spent the rest of his life excavating Göbekli Tepe, uncovering its secrets, defending his interpretations. He died in 2014, still arguing, still discovering, still amazed by what these ancient people had accomplished. The work continues without him now. Other archaeologists carrying forward his vision, his questions, his sense of wonder. The discovery changed everything. Before Göbekli Tepe, we thought we understood the sequence. Agriculture first, then surplus, then specialization, then complex society, then monumental architecture, then religion elaborate enough to demand temples. A neat progression, linear, logical. But Göbekli Tepe disrupts that narrative. It says, humans were building temples before they were farming. They were gathering in large numbers before they were living in villages. They were investing enormous labour in purely symbolic structures before they were investing in permanent houses. Why? That's the question that haunts every researcher who works at this site. Why would hunter-gatherers do this? What need did it serve? What belief system motivated it? What vision was so compelling that people returned here year after year, generation after generation to carve and raise and arrange these massive stones? The pillars don't answer. They stand in their silent circles carved with animals and symbols we can only partially interpret. They keep their secrets. They wait for us to ask better questions, to develop better theories, to approach the mystery with the humility it deserves. But they've given us this much. Proof that our ancestors were capable of far more, far earlier than we ever imagined. That the human capacity for meaning-making, for creating sacred space, for building something larger than ourselves, that capacity is ancient, primal, perhaps as fundamental to being human as language itself. The stones emerged from the earth 30 years ago, but they're still emerging, still revealing themselves, still teaching us. The excavation continues. The questions multiply, and the hilltop that waited so long in silence now draws archaeologists, tourists, pilgrims, all seeking connection to this ancient mystery, this threshold moment when wandering peoples decided to stop and build something eternal. The shepherd's discovery opened a door. Behind it, a world we're only beginning to understand. and most of that world still lies buried, still waiting, still patient beneath the Turkish soil. The excavation unfolds slowly. It has to. This isn't treasure hunting. This is archaeology, and archaeology is patient work. You don't dig with shovels. You use trowels, brushes, even dental tools for delicate work. You photograph everything. You measure everything. You record the position of every artifact, every bone fragment, every piece of charcoal that might yield a radiocarbon date. Layer by layer, the earth gives up its secrets. The topsoil comes away first, modern, disturbed by ploughing and grazing. Below that, Byzantine and Roman layers, evidence that people lived here in later eras, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. Below that, early Bronze Age deposits. And then, finally, the layers that matter most. The pre-pottery Neolithic, the time before pottery, before agriculture, when Göbekli Tepe was alive with purpose. The pillars emerge like ancient sleepers waking from long dreams. Imagine watching this process. The soil is carefully removed, bucket by bucket. A shape appears, the top of a T-shaped stone. The excavators work around it, exposing more surface. The pillar is lying horizontal, deliberately placed that way thousands of years ago when the site was ritually closed. They continue digging. 1 metre of stone, 2 metres, 3. The pillar extends down into the earth farther than anyone expected. Some pillars are still standing, vertical, exactly where they were placed 11,000 years ago. Think about that. 11,000 years of wind and rain and earthquakes, and these stones still stand. The limestone is weathered, yes. The surface is pitted and worn. But the basic structure endures. The T-shape is still clear. The carvings, though eroded, are still visible. And what carvings they are. This is where the site moves from impressive to astonishing, because these aren't just shaped stones. They're art. They're covered, some of them, with reliefs of animals carved in shallow bas relief. Lions prowling across the stone surface. Foxes in profile, captured mid-stride. Wild boars with their distinctive bristling backs. Gazelles leaping, snakes coiling. Scorpions with their tails curved. Vultures with wings spread. The craftsmanship is sophisticated. The animals are recognizable, naturalistic. Whoever carved these had observed these creatures closely, had studied their movements, their proportions, their distinctive features. This isn't crude or primitive work. This is skilled artistry, created with stone tools, flint and obsidian pecking and grinding the softer limestone until the image emerged. Run your fingers over these carvings. Hypothetically, of course, the site is protected now, and you'd feel the grooves, the texture where tools shaped stone. You'd feel the smoothness where thousands of hands might have touched the same spot, wearing the surface gentle over centuries of use. You'd feel the connection to the carvers themselves, reaching across impossible expanses of time. But here's what's strange. Here's what deepens the mystery. There are very few human figures. Most of the carvings are animals. The T-shaped pillars themselves might represent humans, the T as a stylized body, the vertical shaft as torso, the horizontal bar as arms or shoulders. Some pillars have arms carved on them, human arms with hands clasped at what would be the waist level. So perhaps the pillars are anthropomorphic. Perhaps they represent beings, ancestors, gods, spirits, standing in eternal witness. But actual human figures, realistic depictions of people? Rare. There's one particularly famous carving, a relief of a naked man, ithyphallic, clearly male. It's unusual. Most of the imagery focuses on animals, on the wild creatures that shared the landscape with the builders. What does that mean? Perhaps humans saw themselves as part of the animal world, not separate from it. Perhaps the animals were totems, symbols of clans or groups. Perhaps they represented spirits or forces. Perhaps they were astronomical, constellations marked in stone. We don't know. We can speculate endlessly, but the stones don't explain themselves. The enclosures themselves follow a pattern. Circular or oval spaces defined by a ring of smaller pillars. In the centre, 2 large pillars, always paired, always T-shaped. The central pillars are the largest, the most impressive, 5 metres tall in some enclosures, 6 metres in others. They dominate the space, draw the eye, anchor the geometry. The floors between the pillars are terrazzo, a kind of lime plaster, polished smooth. You can still see it in some enclosures, patches of ancient flooring that have survived 11,000 years. If you could walk on it, if you could step into one of these circles as they existed originally, your footsteps would echo slightly in the enclosed space. The stone walls would reflect sound. The experience would be immersive, sensory, probably overwhelming. Archaeologists have found benches built into the walls of some enclosures, stone benches where people could sit. This suggests gatherings, rituals that involved observation, participation, community. Not just priests performing ceremonies, but groups of people witnessing, experiencing, together. And the site is massive, larger than initially thought. Ground-penetrating radar reveals more structures, more enclosures still buried. Magnetometry shows anomalies in the soil, evidence of more carved stones, more circles waiting to be excavated. The estimate now is that Göbekli Tepe contains at least 20 circular enclosures, possibly more. The excavated areas represent perhaps 5% of the total site. 5%. That means 95% remains underground, untouched, waiting. Waiting for future archaeologists with better tools. Waiting for new techniques that can extract information without disturbing the structures. Waiting, as these stones have always waited, with infinite patience. The dating confirms the impossible timeline. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material, charcoal from fires, bone fragments from feasts, consistently places the earliest construction phases around 9600 to 9200 BCE. This is layer 3, the deepest, oldest, most monumental layer. Later phases, layer 2, show smaller structures, less ambitious construction. The site's peak was at its beginning. The first builders were the most skilled, the most ambitious, the most devoted to their vision. Why does it decline? Why do later phases show less sophistication? Perhaps the initial burst of energy couldn't be sustained. Perhaps the social organisation required to build the earliest enclosures broke down. Perhaps beliefs changed. Perhaps environmental conditions shifted. We don't know. What we do know is that around 8200 BCE, the site was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned in ruin, but carefully, methodically, filled in with soil and debris. The enclosures were backfilled, the pillars were covered, the site was closed, sealed, preserved. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. Someone decided that Göbekli Tepe's time had ended, that whatever purpose it served had been fulfilled, or had become obsolete or dangerous or simply no longer necessary. And so they buried it. They entombed their ancestors' greatest achievement, creating the mound that would puzzle farmers and shepherds for the next 10,000 years. That act of burial preserved the site. Paradoxically, covering it protected it. The soil shielded the carvings from erosion, the pillars from toppling, the enclosures from complete decay. Without that burial, Göbekli Tepe might have crumbled entirely. We might never have known it existed, so perhaps we should thank whoever made that decision, whoever stood on this hilltop 200 years ago and said, "It's time. Time to let this sleep. Time to cover the stones and move forward into whatever comes next." They couldn't have known that we'd return, that 11,000 years later we'd carefully remove the soil they so carefully placed, that we'd stand in the same circles they stood in, touch the same stones they touched, ask the same questions they might have asked. What does this mean? Why are we here? What connects us to something larger than ourselves? The stones don't answer, but they endure, and their endurance is itself an answer of sorts. It says, what humans build with care and purpose and shared vision can outlast empires, outlast languages, outlast everything except the stone itself and the questions that echo through it. The excavation continues, slowly, patiently, revealing more each season, and every revelation raises more questions, deepens the mystery, connects us more intimately to people we'll never fully understand but can't help but admire. The stones emerge, and as they emerge, so does a different vision of the human past, more complex, more mysterious, more astonishing than we ever imagined. Here's the puzzle that keeps archaeologists awake at night. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had no villages, no permanent settlements, no houses, no storage facilities for grain, no evidence of domesticated animals, at least not in the earliest phases. These were hunter-gatherers, mobile people who should have been moving through the landscape in small bands, following game, gathering wild plants, living the way humans had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet they built this. A massive stone monument requiring thousands of work hours, coordinated labour, sustained effort over generations, all the things we associate with settled agricultural societies, all the things that aren't supposed to be possible for nomadic hunter-gatherers. The evidence is clear. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe have found no trash pits, no hearths, no sleeping areas, none of the markers of permanent habitation. This wasn't a village. This wasn't where people lived. The animal bones found on site are from wild species. Gazelle primarily, also aurochs, wild sheep, wild boar. These are hunting remains, not herding remains. The people feasting here were eating wild game, not domesticated livestock. There's no pottery, not a single potsherd in the earliest layers. This is the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, a time before humans had invented ceramic vessels. They used stone bowls, baskets, animal skins for containers. They hadn't yet made the technological leap to fired clay. So who were these people? Where did they come from? Where did they go when they weren't here building monuments? The best guess, and it's educated speculation, is that Göbekli Tepe was a gathering site, a pilgrimage centre, a place where different groups of hunter-gatherers met periodically for rituals, for feasting, for social bonding. Perhaps they came seasonally, when the gazelle migrations made meat abundant. Perhaps they came for specific ceremonies tied to astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising of particular stars. Different groups would have travelled from different regions, bringing their labour, bringing their knowledge, bringing offerings, meat from hunts, stones for tools, perhaps ritual objects we haven't found. They'd gather on this hilltop, work together on the monuments, perform their ceremonies, feast together, and then disperse again. Return to their nomadic rounds. Come back the next season, the next year, the next generation. This pattern is known from ethnographic studies. Modern hunter-gatherers often have aggregation sites, places where multiple bands gather at certain times of year. These gatherings serve important functions. They allow young people to find mates outside their immediate kin group, preventing inbreeding. They facilitate trade and gift exchange. They enable the sharing of information, where game is abundant, where dangers lurk, where resources can be found. And they reinforce social bonds, creating networks that span large territories. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was one of these aggregation sites, but scaled up, monumentalized, made permanent through stone rather than remaining temporary like a seasonal camp. The rituals performed here must have been significant enough to justify the enormous investment of labour. The social bonds created here must have been vital enough to bring people back again and again. But how many people? That's hard to estimate. Moving a 20-ton pillar from the quarry to an enclosure would require dozens of workers, maybe 50, maybe 100. Coordinating them would require organisation, leadership, shared purpose. Carving the reliefs would require skilled specialists who'd practiced their craft over years. Feeding everyone during construction would require surplus food, lots of it. Some researchers suggest that hundreds of people might have gathered at Göbekli Tepe during peak periods, perhaps even thousands, though that seems high for hunter-gatherer groups. But even hundreds would be unprecedented. Hunter-gatherer bands typically number 20 to 50 people. Gatherings might bring together a few hundred at most. But sustained construction requiring that many people working together over years or decades, that's organisational. Complexity we don't usually associate with pre-agricultural societies. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we've underestimated what pre-agricultural societies could achieve. Maybe the old model, agriculture leads to surplus, leads to specialisation, leads to complexity, is too simple. Maybe complexity can emerge from ritual needs, from social requirements, from the human drive to create meaning, and maybe that complexity can, in turn, drive the adoption of agriculture. This is Klaus Schmidt's argument. He suggested that Göbekli Tepe represents the reverse of the traditional sequence. Religion first, then agriculture. The need to feed the crowds gathering at this sacred site drove people to intensify their harvesting of wild grains. That intensification led to selective breeding, choosing the seeds with desirable traits, planting them deliberately. And selective breeding led, over generations, to domestication. To the invention of agriculture, it's a compelling theory. It's not universally accepted. Archaeology rarely produces universal agreement, but it's plausible. It fits the evidence. And it suggests that our spiritual needs, our search for meaning, our impulse to create sacred space, might be as fundamental to human nature as our need for food and shelter. Take a breath. Let that idea settle. Humans building temples before farms, creating sacred architecture before practical architecture, investing in meaning before investing in mere survival. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had the same brains we do, the same cognitive capacity. They could plan, imagine, coordinate, create. They had language. Certainly they did, though we'll never hear a word of it. They had art, music, ritual, mythology. They had everything we have except the material culture, except the accumulated knowledge, except the 10,000 years of technological development that separates them from us. In some ways, they might have been our equals. In some ways, perhaps our superiors. They lived closer to the natural world. They knew their environment with an intimacy we've lost. They could read weather, track animals, find water, identify hundreds of edible plants. They navigated by stars, by landmarks, by accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. And they built this monument to their beliefs, their vision, their sense that life meant more than just survival, that there were questions worth asking, mysteries worth honouring, forces worth appeasing or celebrating or connecting with through carved stone and ritual gathering. We don't know their names. We'll never know their names. They left no writing, no inscriptions identifying themselves. They're anonymous, as most humans who've ever lived are anonymous. But they left this, and this speaks for them. This says, we were here. We mattered. We built something that would outlast us. We created beauty and meaning in a harsh world. We were human in the fullest sense, not just surviving, but seeking, questioning, building, imagining. The stones carry their message across 11,000 years, and we're finally learning to listen. Learning to set aside our assumptions about what primitive people could or couldn't do. Learning to recognize sophistication in forms we didn't expect. Learning to honor the mystery rather than demanding easy answers. The builders had no villages, but they had something else. They had shared vision. They had collective purpose. They had the will to transform stone into meaning, and that might be more impressive than any village, any farm, any of the sedentary comforts we think of as civilization. The mystery deepens, but the wonder grows. And in that wonder, we find connection to these ancient people who looked at a hilltop and saw not just rock and grass, but possibility. Sacred possibility. Worth building for, worth gathering for, worth remembering for 11,000 years. At its height, and the height came first, remarkably. Göbekli Tepe must have been extraordinary. Not a city, not even a village, but something else entirely. A sacred landscape, a place where earth touched sky, where human effort reached towards something eternal. Imagine standing here around 9400 BCE. The hilltop has been transformed. Where once there was only natural limestone and wild grass, now there are structures. Stone circles rising from the ridge, pillars standing against the sky. Spaces defined, carved out, made deliberate. The transformation isn't complete. It never will be, not in any single lifetime, but it's already remarkable. You approach from the south, perhaps. You've been walking for days with your band, 30 people carrying supplies, tools, children on shoulders. You've made this journey before. Your parents made it. Your grandparents told stories of this place, and now you see it. The pillars visible from a distance marking the sacred hilltop. Your pace quickens. After all the walking, all the anticipation, you're almost there. The enclosures are arranged across the summit. Not randomly. There's pattern here, though we don't fully understand it. The circles aren't identical. Each is unique. Some are larger, some smaller. Some have more elaborate carvings, some are simpler. But they share the same basic geometry. The circular or oval boundary, the ring of smaller pillars, the two tall central pillars standing like sentinels or priests or gods. Layer 3, as archaeologists call the oldest level, contains the most impressive structures. These are the earliest constructions, and paradoxically they're the most sophisticated. The largest pillars, the most detailed carvings, the most carefully crafted spaces. Later phases will show decline, simplification. But here, at the beginning, the builders invested everything they had. The largest enclosures measure up to 20 metres across. That's bigger than most houses today. Within that space, the twin central pillars dominate. 5 metres tall, 6 metres, massive. T-shaped monoliths weighing 15-20 tons. They're not roughly hewn, they're carefully shaped. The surfaces work smooth in places, the T-form deliberate and exact. If you could run your hand down one of these pillars, if you could trace its length from the horizontal bar down to where it's set into the bedrock, you'd feel cool limestone beneath your palm, smooth where tools have polished it, rough where the natural stone remains, and you'd feel the carvings, animals in relief. A fox here, its bushy tail clearly defined, a scorpion there, tail curled, snakes flowing across the stone like water made solid. The central pillars have arms, human arms carved at what would be waist height if these were human figures. The hands are positioned at the front, fingers clearly defined as if clasped or holding something. This suggests the pillars represent beings, not abstract symbols but entities. Ancestors perhaps, gods, spirits, beings with agency, with presence, with the power to witness and perhaps to act. Around these central pillars, the ring of smaller stones creates a boundary, a threshold between ordinary space and sacred space. To enter the enclosure is to step into a different realm. The terrazzo floor, polished lime plaster, would feel different underfoot than the rough ground outside. Smoother, more deliberate, crafted. Stone benches line parts of the perimeter. People could sit here, watch, participate in whatever rituals unfolded in the centre. This wasn't theatre. There's no stage, no clear division between performers and audience. But there was space for gathering, for witnessing, for being part of something larger than individual existence. The site contains at least 20 of these enclosures, perhaps more. Ground-penetrating radar suggests structures still buried, still waiting to be excavated. If each enclosure could hold 50 people, a conservative estimate, then the entire site during a major gathering could accommodate hundreds, maybe 1,000, maybe more. Where did they come from? The archaeological evidence suggests a large catchment area. Obsidian found at Göbekli Tepe comes from volcanoes in Cappadocia, hundreds of kilometers to the north. This means trade networks. This means people traveling long distances, carrying precious materials, bringing them to this hilltop as offerings or tools, or simply because the work here demanded the best stones available. The organisation required is staggering. Someone had to coordinate the labour. Someone had to decide which pillars went where. Someone had to teach the carving techniques, the quarrying methods, the process of moving massive stones up a hill without metal tools or wheels or draft animals. This knowledge was passed down, refined, improved over generations. Perhaps there were specialists, master builders who understood stone, who could look at a block and see the pillar hidden inside it. Master carvers who could transform that pillar into art. Perhaps these specialists travelled between sites because Göbekli Tepe isn't unique anymore. Other similar sites are being discovered in the region. Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori. The whole area was alive with this temple-building culture. But Göbekli Tepe was the first, the largest, the most elaborate. This was the centre, the prototype, the place where the vision was realised most completely. The effort invested here is almost incomprehensible. Quarrying a 20-ton pillar with stone tools, shaping it, moving it, erecting it, carving it, and then doing it again and again. 20 enclosures, each requiring multiple pillars, hundreds of carved stones, thousands of work hours, maybe tens of thousands, maybe more, and for what? Not defence. There are no fortifications, not shelter. No one lived here. Not food storage, no granaries, no permanent structures for habitation. All this effort for ritual, for meaning, for connection to whatever they believed governed existence. Perhaps that tells us something important. Perhaps it says that meaning isn't a luxury, that creating sacred space isn't optional, that humans need connection to something larger than themselves, as much as we need food and water and shelter. And perhaps, that need can drive us to extraordinary achievements. The sky overhead would have been the same sky we see now, the same stars barely shifted in their positions. At night, with no artificial light for hundreds of kilometres, the Milky Way would blaze across the darkness, so bright it would cast shadows, so clear you could see structure in it, depth, the sense of looking into infinite distance. Did they know what it was? Did they tell stories about that river of light? Did they see it as the path souls took after death? As the spine of the world? As a celestial river matching the Euphrates below? We don't know. But they must have looked. They must have wondered. And perhaps some of the symbols carved on the pillars represent what they saw. Constellations, stellar patterns, maps of the sacred geography above mirroring the sacred geography they were creating on this hilltop. The site was alive, not with permanent residents, but with periodic influxes of people, coming, working, celebrating, feasting, then departing. The rhythm would have been cyclical, seasonal perhaps, tied to migrations, to harvests of wild grain, to celestial events marking time's passage. But this wouldn't last forever. Nothing does. Already, perhaps, the seeds of change were present. Already the intensification of wild grain harvesting was leading toward domestication. Already the social patterns created by these gatherings were laying groundwork for permanent villages. Already the future was germinating in the present, invisible but inevitable. For now, though, the temple complex stands at its peak, the vision realized, the stones raised, the sacred space created and maintained and honored by people who believed, must have believed, deeply, that this mattered, that this was worth everything they could give. The pillars stand, the circles wait, and the mystery of what happened here, what was experienced here, what connected these ancient people to forces we can only imagine, that mystery endures, carved in stone, preserved by burial, revealed at last to eyes that can see the achievement but can never fully grasp the meaning. Something hidden still remains to be explored, not just in the unexcavated portions of the site, but in the experience itself, in what it meant to stand in these circles, to participate in these rituals, to be part of this extraordinary collective effort. The stones can show us what, but the why, the deep why, the human why, that stays hidden, that waits in the silence between the pillars, in the space where ancient voices once chanted words we'll never hear. The stone speaks in images, not in words. There are no words carved here, no writing, no inscriptions we can read, but in animals, in creatures rendered with skill and care and something that looks like reverence. Lions prowl across the pillars. You can see them in relief, their muscular bodies captured mid-stride, manes flowing, mouths open. These aren't timid house cats made large. These are apex predators, dangerous, magnificent. Lions that actually lived in this region 11,000 years ago, hunting the same gazelle herds that humans hunted, competing for the same resources. To carve a lion is to honour it, or fear it, or both. Perhaps it was a clan symbol, the lion people, the ones who claimed descent or connection to this powerful creature. Perhaps it represented courage, strength, the qualities a hunter needed. Perhaps it was a spiritual guardian, a totem animal that protected those who honoured it. The foxes are different, smaller, more cunning than powerful. They appear on multiple pillars, rendered with careful attention to detail, the bushy tail, the pointed ears, the slender body built for speed, and stealth. What did foxes mean to the builders? Tricksters, perhaps, as they are in many mythologies, clever survivors, creatures that thrive in the margins, adapting to whatever circumstances they encounter. Wild boars appear too, bristling, aggressive, their distinctive profile unmistakable. These were dangerous animals to hunt, powerful, fast, willing to charge when cornered. Hunting boar required courage and coordination. Perhaps carving them on sacred pillars honoured that danger, marked the respect hunters felt for their quarry. Gazelle leap across the stone, graceful, swift. These were the primary prey animal in the region, providing most of the meat consumed at Göbekli Tepe. The archaeological deposits are full of gazelle bones, evidence of massive communal feasts. To carve gazelle might be to honour the animals that fed the community, to ensure their continued abundance, to acknowledge the debt humans owed to these creatures who gave their lives so people could live. And then there are the stranger carvings. Snakes coiling around pillars, multiple snakes sometimes, intertwined, flowing across the stone surface. Snakes are powerful symbols in many cultures, associated with transformation because they shed their skin, with danger because of venom, with wisdom because they're mysterious and ancient. What did they mean here? We can only speculate. Scorpions appear frequently, their segmented tails curved in that distinctive threatening posture. Scorpions are small but deadly. A sting can kill, especially in the absence of modern medicine. Perhaps they represented danger lurking in unexpected places. Perhaps they were apotropaic, images meant to ward off evil, to protect the sacred space. Perhaps they were astronomical, The constellation Scorpius was visible in this latitude, rising in the southern sky. Vultures are among the most striking carvings. Wings spread wide, heads lowered. These are birds of death, carrion eaters, creatures that exist at the boundary between life and decay. In many ancient cultures, vultures were sacred. They were psychopomps, guides who led souls from the world of the living to whatever came after. Sky burial, the practice of leaving dead bodies for vultures to consume, was practiced in some nearby cultures. Perhaps it was practiced here too. Imagine watching a carver at work. They've selected a pillar. Perhaps they've consulted with elders, with ritual specialists, about what images should appear here. Perhaps they've dreamed of the animals. Perhaps they've fasted and entered visionary states to receive guidance. Or perhaps it's simpler. Perhaps each clan or group contributes a carving, marking their participation in the site's creation. The carver uses stone tools, flint primarily, sharp, hard, capable of pecking and grinding softer limestone. They work slowly. This isn't something you rush. A single relief might take days, weeks. The carver pecks at the surface, removing tiny fragments of stone. Gradually a shape emerges, the outline of an animal, then the details, eyes, claws, fur texture rendered in shallow grooves. Other people might watch. Children learning the craft, elders offering advice. The work is communal, even when one person holds the tool. Everyone has investment. Everyone has opinions. The carving, when finished, belongs to the community, not the individual. But here's what's strange. Here's what deepens the mystery. There are very few human figures among these carvings. Animals dominate overwhelmingly. The pillars themselves might be anthropomorphic, the T-shape suggesting a human form, the carved arms making it explicit. But realistic human images, rare. There's a naked man on one pillar, clearly human, clearly male, but that's unusual. Mostly it's animals. What does that mean? Perhaps humans didn't see themselves as separate from the animal world. Perhaps the boundaries we draw, human versus animal, culture versus nature, didn't exist for them in the same way. Perhaps they saw themselves as one kind of being among many, not privileged, not separate, just different expressions of the same life force. Or perhaps the animals represented something else entirely. Stellar constellations, seasonal markers, mythological beings that were part animal, part spirit, part something we don't have words for. The meanings are lost, the symbols remain. Some researchers have suggested that the animal carvings form a narrative, that if you read them in sequence around a pillar or across an enclosure, they tell a story. Creation myths, perhaps. Flood stories. Tales of how the world began, or how humans came to be. But without the accompanying oral tradition, we can't decode the narrative. We just see images. Beautiful, mysterious, silent. There are more ancient places waiting, more mysteries carved in stone, more nights of wonder we can share together, so hit the like button now. The H symbols appear on some pillars, abstract designs, too vertical, lines connected by one or more horizontal bars. They look almost like letters, but they're not writing. They're symbols, but symbols of what? Doorways, ladders, representations of the pillars themselves? No one knows. They appear repeatedly, suggesting they carried meaning, but that meaning is inaccessible to us. Crescents appear too. Moon symbols, perhaps. Tracking lunar cycles. Many hunter-gatherer societies paid close attention to the moon. Its phases marked time, affected tides, influenced animal behaviour. Perhaps the crescents were calendrical. Perhaps they were sacred. Perhaps both. The craftsmanship varies. Some carvings are sophisticated, detailed, clearly the work of skilled specialists. Others are cruder, simpler, perhaps done by less experienced carvers, or by community members adding their own contributions. This variety suggests participation, not just a priestly class maintaining the site, but broader involvement. People coming, working, leaving their mark, and the animals are almost all wild. No domesticated species appear in the earliest layers. No sheep with the heavy wool of domestic breeds. No cattle showing signs of selection for tractability. This is a wild world, reflected in stone. A world where humans and animals coexist, where the boundary between them is porous, where respect and fear and wonder all mingle in how people relate to the creatures they hunt, flee from, or simply observe. Maybe the carvings were prayers, each animal an offering, an invocation, a request for abundance or protection. Maybe they were teaching tools, ways of passing knowledge about animal behaviour, about what to hunt and when, about danger and opportunity. Maybe they were simply art, expressions of beauty, of creativity, of the human need to make meaning through images. The stone holds the carvings, but it doesn't hold the explanations. Those died with the carvers, with the communities who gathered here, with the last person who knew what the fox and the snake and the vulture really meant when they appeared together on a pillar in the sacred circle. We're left with wonder, with images that move us even though we don't understand them, with art that reaches across 11,000 years and still communicates something, not specific meaning, but the fact of meaning. The proof that these people cared about more than survival, that they carved beauty into stone because beauty mattered, because meaning mattered, because the animals sharing their world were worthy of being remembered, honoured, preserved forever in limestone. The carvings wait, patient as the stone that holds them, and every generation that sees them brings new interpretations, new theories, new wonder. The meaning shifts, but the mystery endures, and perhaps that's what was intended all along. The bones tell a story, thousands of them, animal bones scattered through the archaeological deposits at Göbekli Tepe, concentrated in certain areas mixed with ash and charcoal and broken stone tools, the remnants of meals, evidence of feasting on a scale that seems impossible for hunter-gatherers. Gazelle bones predominate, shoulder blades, leg bones, ribs, skulls, all showing butchering marks, cuts where stone knives separated meat from bone, percussion marks where bones were broken to extract marrow. Gazelle provided most of the meat consumed here. Makes sense. They were abundant, migratory, arriving in huge herds at predictable times. Hunting them required coordination but not exceptional skill, and they were delicious. But not just gazelle. Aurochs' bones appear too. Those massive wild cattle that once roamed Europe and the Near East before going extinct in the 17th century. Hunting an aurochs was dangerous. These animals could weigh a ton, stood 2 meters at the shoulder, had enormous horns they weren't afraid to use. Killing one required bravery, teamwork, careful planning. And butchering one provided enough meat to feed many people, wild sheep, wild boar, birds, even some fish, though the site is inland. The variety suggests abundance, or at least periodic abundance, times when food was plentiful enough that hundreds of people could gather, feast, work on the monuments, and feast again without worrying about starvation. The bones are found in specific contexts, near the enclosures, in deposits that suggest deliberate placement rather than random refuse. Perhaps the feasting was part of the ritual. Perhaps sharing meat was sacred. Perhaps the act of eating together, of killing an animal, preparing it, distributing it, consuming it communally, was central to whatever ceremonies took place here. Imagine the scene. It's spring, perhaps. The gazelle herds are migrating through the region. Hunting parties have been successful, very successful. They've killed dozens of animals, more than their own small band could eat before the meat spoiled, so they bring it here, to Göbekli Tepe, where other bands are gathering, where the work continues on the latest enclosure, where the rituals will be performed under the stars. The smell of roasting meat fills the air, smoke rises from multiple fires. People are everywhere, hundreds of them, maybe more. Some are working, moving stones, carving reliefs. Others are preparing food, skinning animals, cutting meat into portions. Children run between the fires, playing, laughing, absorbing the atmosphere of celebration and purpose. As evening falls, the work pauses. People gather, perhaps in one of the enclosures, perhaps in the open space between them. The meat is distributed, not randomly. There are rules, probably, protocols. The hunters who killed the animals get portions. The elders get portions. The specialists who carve the pillars get portions. Everyone gets something, but not equally. Social structure is being reinforced through food distribution. They eat, sitting on the stone benches, standing in groups, tearing meat with their teeth. These are people before. Metal knives made cutting easier. The meat is tough, probably. Wild game is lean, muscular. But it's good. It's protein. It's energy. And it's shared. That sharing matters. It binds the community. It creates obligation, reciprocity, relationship. Stone vessels have been found at Göbekli Tepe. Large ones. Basins carved from limestone. What were they for? Some researchers suggest beer. The idea isn't as strange as it sounds. Beer is one of humanity's oldest inventions. Wild grains ferment naturally if they get wet and are left to sit. Someone, somewhere, discovered that the resulting liquid was intoxicating. that it altered consciousness, that it made celebration more celebratory. Perhaps they brewed beer here, gathered wild barley, soaked it, let it ferment in those stone basins. Perhaps drinking was part of the ritual. Altered states of consciousness often are, in sacred contexts. Perhaps the ceremonies involved not just feasting, but intoxication, drumming, dancing, chanting, all the techniques humans use to transcend ordinary awareness and touch something numinous. The feasting wasn't constant. The site shows no evidence of permanent habitation. People came, stayed for a time, then left. Perhaps seasonally, perhaps for specific ceremonies, perhaps when the abundance of game made it possible to feed large gatherings. The pattern would have been cyclical: anticipation, arrival, intense activity, celebration, departure, then silence until the next gathering. But during those gatherings the hilltop would have been alive, not just with people, but with purpose, with shared effort directed towards something beyond individual survival, with the creation of community through labour and ritual and shared meals. This is how societies form, not through conquest or coercion, through voluntary cooperation, through choosing to be part of something larger. The feasts served practical functions too: redistribution of food from successful hunters to less successful ones, formation of alliances between different groups, arrangement of marriages to prevent inbreeding in small bands, exchange of information about where resources were located, where dangers lurked. All the social business that needs doing in a society without writing, without formal institutions, without any organisational structure beyond kinship and custom. But it was more than practical. It had to be, because practical needs could be met without building monuments, without carving stones, without investing thousands of hours in creating sacred space. The feasting happened in a ritual context. It was sacred feasting. Consuming meat wasn't just nutrition, it was communion, with each other, with the animals who gave their lives, with the forces or beings or ancestors who ensured abundance, with the cosmos itself. Maybe they told stories during these feasts, stories about the animals carved on the pillars, about the ancestors, about the creation of the world, about why humans hunt gazelle, and fear lions and watch vultures with mixed awe and dread. The stories are gone now, lost with the language, but the bones remain, silent witnesses to celebrations held 11,000 years ago. The quantities are significant. Too much meat for a small group. This was mass consumption, evidence of gatherings involving hundreds of people, possibly more. For hunter-gatherers to assemble in those numbers, even briefly, represents social organisation we didn't think they possessed. It requires peaceful cooperation between groups that might otherwise compete. It requires planning. It requires trust. And it requires surplus, even temporary surplus. You can't feast if you're starving. You can't afford to spend days working on stone monuments if you're desperately searching for your next meal. The abundance of the region at this time must have been significant. The wild grains growing thick, the herds moving predictably through the landscape, enough to feed not just individual bands but the periodic mass gatherings at sacred sites. Perhaps this abundance was changing how people thought. Perhaps having more than enough, even temporarily, open space for new ideas, for asking questions beyond where is the next meal. Questions like, what does it mean? And what happens after death? And how do we honour what's sacred? The feasting wouldn't last forever. None of this would. Already the intensive harvesting of wild grains was leading toward domestication. Already the pattern of returning to the same sites was laying groundwork for permanent settlement. Already the future was forming. A future of agriculture, of villages, of pottery, and eventually writing and cities and all the complexity we call civilization. But for now, on this hilltop, people feast. They eat meat roasted over open fires. They drink whatever they drink, water from springs, perhaps beer from stone basins. They talk, laugh, tell stories, cement relationships. They work together on monuments that will outlast them by thousands of years, and they create, however temporarily, a community. A we, a shared identity built from stone and ritual, and the simple act of eating together. The bones remain, testimony to appetite and abundance, to gatherings and celebrations, to people who weren't so different from us, who enjoyed a good meal, who valued community, who created meaning through shared experience. The smoke from those ancient fires has long since dispersed. but the bones remember. And in remembering, they connect us to those feast days when the hilltop buzzed with voices, with purpose, with life. The stones didn't appear magically. Someone had to cut them, shape them, move them, raise them. Every pillar, every carved relief, every ton of limestone required human effort. Extraordinary effort. And the question of how exactly they did this, haunts everyone who studies Göbekli Tepe. The quarry is still visible. Just a short distance from the enclosures there's a depression in the limestone bedrock. This is where the pillars came from. You can see it clearly. The bedrock cut away, shaped. The ghost impressions of where stones were removed. It's not a deep quarry, more like a surface working. But it's extensive. Stones were cut here for centuries probably, each enclosure requiring multiple pillars, each pillar requiring days or weeks of work. The process started with selection, looking at the bedrock, understanding its structure, identifying where natural weaknesses could be exploited. Limestone has bedding planes, layers where it's more likely to split. Find those planes, and you can work with them instead of against them, marking the outline of the pillar, perhaps with charcoal or ochre, perhaps just by eye, trusting experience. The T-shape had to be planned. The proportions had to be right. Too thin, and the pillar might break during quarrying or transport. Too thick, and it would be impossibly heavy, then the cutting. Stone tools only. Flint, primarily. Obsidian for finer work, though obsidian had to be imported from distant volcanoes. Precious material for precious work. The tools were handheld, not hafted to long handles like later metal tools would be. The work was intimate, close, hands-on, pecking at the limestone. That's the main technique. Using a harder stone to strike the softer limestone repeatedly. Each strike removes tiny fragments. Gradually, so gradually, a groove forms, the groove deepens. You're cutting around the pillar, isolating it from the surrounding bedrock. Top and sides first. The bottom you leave attached for now. It anchors the pillar while you work. How long did this take? Days, certainly. Weeks, probably. Maybe longer for the largest pillars. This wasn't fast work. This was patient, repetitive, physically demanding labour. Your hands would blister, your shoulders would ache. The limestone dust would coat your skin, get in your eyes, fill your lungs, but you'd continue, because this mattered. Because the community needed this stone. Because the sacred space being created on the hilltop required these pillars. Because your effort was part of something larger than yourself. Once the pillar was cut free on 3 sides, the final separation, using wedges probably. Wooden wedges driven into cracks in the bedrock, then soaked with water. As the wood swells, it exerts force. The crack widens. Eventually the pillar breaks free from the bottom. It's separated now, free from the bedrock that held it for millions of years. But now comes the harder part. Moving it. A 20-ton stone doesn't move easily. It doesn't want to move at all. Gravity and friction conspire to keep it exactly where it is. Overcoming those forces requires ingenuity, effort, and many hands working together. First, you have to get it out of the quarry. Maybe you use levers, long wooden poles positioned under the stone, multiple people pushing down on one end, lifting the stone incrementally, packing smaller, stones underneath to support it, lifting again, packing again, gradually working the pillar up and out of the depression where it was cut. Then transport. The quarry is close to the enclosures, maybe 50 meters, maybe 100. Not far, but far enough when you're moving tons of stone. No wheels, no carts, no draft animals, just human muscle and simple machines. Levers, rollers, ramps. Wooden rollers might work. Cut logs to roughly the same diameter. Lay them parallel on the ground. Position the stone on top. As you push or pull the stone forward, it rolls on the logs. The rear logs emerge as the stone moves. You pick them up, carry them to the front, place them ahead of the stone. Repeat, slow, inefficient, but possible, or sledges. Lash wood into a flat platform, position the stone on it, drag the whole thing. On dry limestone that's difficult, too much friction. But wet the ground first, or lay down a track of smaller stones or wood, and friction decreases. It's still exhausting work. Still requires dozens of people pulling ropes, coordinating their effort, but it's possible. Ropes. Where do you get ropes strong enough to pull 20 tons? Plant fibers. Flax, maybe. Hemp. Grass is woven and twisted into cord. Layer cords together into thicker rope. It won't last forever. Organic materials degrade, especially under stress. But it doesn't need to last forever, just long enough to move this stone this distance. Then you make new rope for the next stone. Imagine the coordination required. 50 people, 100 people, all pulling together. Someone has to direct them. Someone has to coordinate the rhythm. Perhaps they chant. Perhaps they sing. Work songs that keep everyone moving in time, that make the labour bearable, that transform individual effort into collective achievement. Slowly, the stone moves, meters at a time, maybe only a few meters per day, but it moves up the slope, toward the enclosure, toward the position where it will stand for the next 11,000 years. And then the hardest part, raising it. Getting a 20-ton horizontal stone into a vertical position requires leverage, patience, and nerve. Dig a pit where you want the stone to stand, deeper on one side than the other, creating a ramp. Slide or roll the stone so one end projects over the deep part of the pit. That end drops. The stone tilts. Now it's at an angle. Use levers under the raised end. Long wooden poles positioned under the stone. Multiple people pushing down. The stone lifts incrementally. Pack smaller stones and earth under the raised end to support it. Lift again. Pack again. The angle increases. The stone stands more upright. This might take days. Careful, careful work. If the stone slips, it could crush people. If it falls wrong, it could break. But eventually it's vertical, standing. The pit is filled around it, packing earth and stones tightly to hold it in place. It's done. One pillar raised, only dozens more to go. The labour required is staggering. But perhaps that's part of the point. Perhaps the effort itself is sacred. Perhaps struggling together, suffering together, succeeding together, perhaps that's what creates community. What bonds people across kinship lines, across different bands and groups. Shared ordeal, shared accomplishment, shared pride in what's been built. Modern experimental archaeology has attempted to recreate these techniques. Using period-appropriate tools and methods to move large stones, the experiments confirm it's possible. Difficult but possible. Humans with stone tools and wooden rope can move multi-ton stones, can carve them, can raise them, can create monuments that endure. But the experiments also reveal how much knowledge was required, how much trial and error, how many failures must have occurred before success. The techniques we see preserved in Göbekli Tepe's stones represent accumulated wisdom. Generations of learning, mistakes that taught lessons, successes that were remembered and repeated. That knowledge was probably specialised. Master builders who understood stone, who'd spent decades working with it, who could assess a block and know whether it would work for a particular purpose. Apprentices learning from masters, absorbing knowledge through observation and practice. Knowledge that was oral, embodied, preserved in hands and muscles and eyes, trained to see what less experienced eyes would miss. And all of this, all the quarrying and moving and raising and carving, all of it done for structures that served no practical purpose, no defence, no shelter, no food storage, pure ritual, pure meaning, pure connection to whatever sacred forces these people believed in. That's the real mystery, not how they did it. We can reconstruct the methods more or less. But why? Why invest so much? Why care so much? Why build something meant to outlast you, meant to serve purposes you might experience only a few times in your life during seasonal gatherings? The stones don't answer that question. They just stand. Patient monuments to human determination, human creativity, human need for meaning. They prove that it was done. That people 11,000 years ago possessed the skill, the knowledge, the organisational capacity to transform vision into stone reality. The quarry remains, silent witness to the labour. The depressions in the bedrock still show where pillars were cut. And if you could place your hand where ancient hands worked, if you could feel the stone that felt their tools, you'd be touching the same surface they touched. Reaching across time to shake hands, in a sense, with people whose names we'll never know, but whose achievement we can't help but honour. The question of how has largely been answered. The question of why, that remains. That waits in the silence between the stones, in the space where meaning lives beyond explanation. Beneath the obvious, beneath the stone and carvings and evidence of feasting lies something else, something quieter, something that requires patience to see. The relationship between earth and sky, between the monuments built on this hilltop and the stars wheeling overhead. The ancients watched the heavens. This isn't speculation. Every culture we know of, at every time in history, has paid attention to celestial movements. The sky is the first calendar, the first clock, the only reliable way to mark time's passage when you have no written records, no mechanical devices, nothing but observation and memory. For hunter-gatherers, tracking the sky was essential. Certain stars appearing at dusk meant summer was coming, others meant winter. The moon's phases marked time in monthly increments. The sun's position on the horizon at sunrise shifted through the year, reaching its northernmost point at summer solstice, its southernmost at winter solstice. These patterns were predictable, reliable, sacred, almost in their constancy. Göbekli Tepe was built with attention to these patterns. Perhaps not all of it. Perhaps some enclosures were oriented randomly or according to principles we don't understand, but some show alignment, deliberate positioning, connection between stone and stars. The evidence is subtle, not as dramatic as Stonehenge's midsummer sunrise alignment, where the sun's rays shoot perfectly through the monument's axis on the longest day, but present nonetheless. Researchers studying the site have measured the orientations of the enclosures. They've used astronomical software to recreate the sky as it appeared 11,000 years ago. The stars have shifted slightly in their positions due to precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. And they've found patterns. Some enclosures appear oriented to specific stars or constellations. The brightest stars in particular, Deneb, Sirius, Vega, those brilliant points that would have dominated the ancient night sky. Perhaps the central pillars were aligned to mark where these stars rose on certain significant nights. Perhaps the entire hilltop was a kind of observatory, a place where skywatching wasn't just practical but sacred. The star Sirius draws special attention. It's the brightest star in the night sky, impossible to miss. In many ancient cultures, Sirius had significance. Its heliacal rising, the first time it becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn, often marked important dates. In ancient Egypt, Sirius's rising coincided with the Nile's flood, an event so crucial to agriculture that it defined the calendar. For the people building Göbekli Tepe, Sirius might have marked something different. Perhaps the gazelle migrations, perhaps the time when wild grains ripened, perhaps simply a moment of cosmic significance, an alignment between earth and sky worth noting, worth honouring in stone. Some researchers have suggested that the animal carvings themselves might be astronomical, that the constellations we know today might have older counterparts, that the fox and lion and scorpion carved on pillars might represent star patterns these ancient people saw in the night sky. It's possible. Many cultures map the sky this way. The Greeks did it, the Babylonians, the Chinese, indigenous peoples across the world. Why not the builders of Göbekli Tepe? The scorpion is particularly suggestive. We have a constellation called Scorpius. It's ancient, recognized across many cultures. Its distinctive shape, curved tail, extended claws, appears in the southern sky. Perhaps the scorpions carved on Göbekli Tepe's pillars reference this constellation. Perhaps seeing it rise at certain times of year triggered gatherings, rituals, the seasonal rounds that brought people to this hilltop. But we have to be careful. It's easy to see patterns that aren't there, to project our own understanding onto ancient symbols and assume we've decoded them. The truth is, we don't know what these people called the constellations. We don't know how they grouped the stars. We don't even know for certain that they did group them, though it seems likely. What we can say is that the sky mattered to them. It must have. They built monuments aligned to celestial patterns. They carved animals that might represent stars. They created a sacred landscape where Earth mirrored heaven, where human effort reached toward cosmic order. Imagine standing in one of the enclosures at night. The moon hasn't risen yet. The darkness is absolute except for the stars, and there are so many stars. No light pollution, no artificial glow drowning out the fainter points. Just the Milky Way blazing overhead like a river of light. So bright you can see colours in it. Depth, structure. The central pillars rise against this backdrop, dark against luminous. Their T-shapes might frame certain stars, might direct your gaze towards specific points in the sky. The space between the pillars becomes a window, a threshold, a way of focusing attention on what matters. Perhaps rituals, were timed to celestial events. Perhaps when a particular star reached a particular position, it was time for a ceremony, time for sacrifice, time for initiation, time for renewal. The stars would signal when, and the community would respond. This creates a profound connection. You're not just living on Earth. You're participating in cosmic patterns. Your life is aligned with celestial movements that have been occurring since before humans existed and will continue after we're gone. That's comforting in a way. It means you're part of something larger. It means the chaos of daily life, the uncertainty of hunting, the danger of predators, the vulnerability of existence. All of that is contained within a greater order. The stars return, the seasons cycle, the pattern holds, and by aligning your monuments, your rituals, your sacred time to those patterns, you participate in that order. You become part of the cosmic dance. The sun matters too, of course. Solstices and equinoxes, the moments when the sun reaches its extremes or balances at the midpoint. These were significant in most ancient cultures. They mark time, they define seasons, and they're dramatic. Anyone paying attention notices that the sun rises at different points on the horizon throughout the year. Tracking those points gives you a calendar. Building monuments that capture sunrise at key moments makes the calendar permanent, makes it sacred. Some of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures may be solstice-aligned. The evidence isn't conclusive. The site is complex, the orientation's varied, the excavation's incomplete. But suggestive. Enough to make researchers wonder. Enough to make careful measurements, to wait for solstice sunrise, to see if light enters an enclosure in some significant way. Even if specific alignments remain uncertain, the principle is clear. These people watched the sky. They understood cycles. They saw order in celestial movements and reflected that order in stone. The monuments weren't just earthbound. They were cosmological. They connected this hilltop to the infinite. Perhaps that's part of why they gathered here. Perhaps this place was special, not just geographically, but cosmologically. Perhaps from this ridge, at this latitude, certain stars were visible that couldn't be seen elsewhere. Perhaps the view of the horizon was particularly clear, making astronomical observation easier. Perhaps the site itself was chosen because it facilitated connection between Earth and sky. We may never know the full extent of their astronomical knowledge. The calculations are lost. The observations unrecorded except in stone orientation. But we can stand where they stood, look up at the same stars, barely shifted after 11,000 years, and feel the same wonder they must have felt. The same questions. Where do we come from? What is our place in this vast cosmos? How do we mark our brief existence against the eternal? The stars don't answer. They never have, but they witness. They've watched every human who ever looked up and wondered. They watched the builders of Göbekli Tepe. They watch us now, and they'll watch whoever comes after, long after our monuments crumble, long after our questions are forgotten. The alignment continues. Earth orbits sun, stars trace their paths, and the stones, patient as always, mark the relationship between stone and starlight, between human aspiration and cosmic indifference, between the temporary and the eternal. The mystery remains, hidden in plain sight, written in stone and stars, waiting for eyes that know how to see. What did they believe? That's the question that haunts every researcher, every visitor, everyone who stands among these ancient stones and tries to imagine the minds that created them. What gods did they worship? What myths did they tell? What explanations did they offer for existence, for death, for the mystery of consciousness trapped in mortal bodies? We'll never know completely. Religion doesn't fossilize. Beliefs don't leave clear traces in the archaeological record. You can find temples, yes, altars, offerings. But the inner content, the theology, the mythology, the spiritual experiences, those exist only in minds and words, both long since vanished. But we can read the symbols, or try to. The carvings on Göbekli Tepe's pillars form a vocabulary, not a written language, but a visual one, a system of signs that carried meaning for those who created them. Our task is to approach that meaning humbly, to acknowledge what we don't know, to speculate carefully, always marking speculation as such. The animals, as we've seen, appear frequently, but some animals appear more than others, some in specific contexts, some in combinations that might be significant. The vultures, for instance. They appear on multiple pillars, always recognizable, always with wings spread, always associated with death in some way. Vultures are liminal creatures. They exist at the boundary between life and death. They don't kill. They wait. They watch. And when death comes, from hunting, from predation, from old age, from any of the 1,000 ways life ends, the vultures descend. They consume the flesh. They return the body to the cycle. They're purifiers, in a sense, agents of transformation. Many cultures have practiced sky burial. The dead are placed on platforms or in open areas where vultures can access them. The body's consumed. The bones are scattered or collected. The person transitions from physical presence to memory, to ancestor, to whatever comes after. Perhaps the people of Göbekli Tepe practiced something similar. Perhaps the vulture carvings reference this. Perhaps they're not just symbols but documentations of actual practice. There's a particularly striking carving, a pillar showing what might be a headless human figure accompanied by a vulture. It's fragmentary, worn, but suggestive. Is it depicting excarnation, the process of flesh removal before burial? Is it showing the moment of death, the soul departing? We can only wonder. The H symbols remain enigmatic. They appear repeatedly. Clearly they meant something. But what? Some researchers suggest they represent doorways, thresholds between worlds, between the living and the dead, between the earthly and the spiritual. The H shape could be two pillars supporting a lintel, an architectural element, abstracted and made symbolic. Or perhaps they're ladders, shamanic ladders. In many cultures, shamans, ritual specialists who mediate between human and spirit worlds, describe climbing ladders or trees or mountains to reach other realms. Perhaps the H symbols represent this, the path upward, the connection between levels of reality, or perhaps they're pillars seen from the front. The T-shaped pillars are the site's most distinctive feature. Perhaps representing them symbolically, the H shape is how you draw two pillars side by side, a way of saying sacred space without carving, grid space, an entire monument. We don't know. The symbols don't come with explanations, they just recur, suggesting meaning, withholding clarity. The absence of certain symbols is also telling. Very few human figures, as we've noted. This is unusual for religious sites. Most sacred architecture features deities, priests, worshippers, human forms in religious contexts. But Göbekli Tepe's imagery focuses on animals, on nature, on the wild world. Perhaps that tells us something about their theology. Perhaps they didn't conceive of gods as anthropomorphic. Perhaps the sacred wasn't embodied in human-like deities, but in forces, in animals, in natural phenomena. Perhaps their religion was animistic, seeing consciousness, seeing spirit in everything. The lion possesses power. The fox possesses cunning. The vulture possesses the ability to transform death. These aren't just traits. They're sacred qualities worth honouring, worth carving in stone. The twin pillars in each enclosure suggest duality, pairing. Perhaps this reflects cosmological beliefs. Many mythologies feature paired deities or forces, sky and earth, sun and moon, male and female, order and chaos. Perhaps the central pillars represent this. Two beings, two principles, standing together, balancing each other, creating the world through their interaction. The pillars have arms, human arms. This anthropomorphizes them, makes them more than abstract symbols. They're beings, perhaps ancestors, the first humans, the primordial pair from whom everyone descends. Perhaps each enclosure represents a different lineage, a different clan, and the central pillars are their founding ancestors, carved in stone, honoured in ritual, standing eternal witness to their descendants' gatherings. Or perhaps they're gods, not in the sense we might imagine, powerful beings who control natural forces, who demand worship, who reward and punish. But perhaps entities, spirits, beings who exist at the boundary between physical and metaphysical, who can be honoured but not controlled, who watch but don't necessarily intervene. The site's layout might encode cosmology, the circular enclosures, the central pillars, the radiating smaller pillars. Perhaps this mirrors how they understood the universe. A centre, the axis mundi, the world tree, the point where earth meets sky, and extending from that centre, radiating outward, the levels of reality. Earth, sky, underworld, all connected, all part of one system. Take a breath here. Let the speculation rest for a moment, because that's all this is, speculation, informed by archaeology, by comparative mythology, by ethnographic studies of other cultures, but still speculation. The actual beliefs, the actual myths, the actual prayers spoken in these enclosures, those are gone, lost in silence. What remains is stone and symbol, and the undeniable fact that this mattered enormously to the people who built it. You don't invest this much effort in something trivial. You don't gather hundreds of people, quarry massive stones, carve intricate reliefs, raise monuments meant to last forever unless what you're expressing is central to your understanding of existence. This was their sacred space, the place where whatever they believed became manifest, became real, became shared. Religion at its most basic isn't about dogma or theology or written texts. It's about creating community through shared belief, through shared ritual, through shared symbols that everyone recognizes, everyone honors, even if not everyone interprets them identically. The symbols served that function. The vulture meant something to everyone who saw it. Maybe not the same thing. Maybe different clans had different stories, different associations. But it was recognized. It was significant. It connected people through shared visual vocabulary. And perhaps that's what survives. Not the specific meanings, but the fact of meaning. Not the particular gods, but the impulse to imagine gods. Not the individual myths, but the human need for myths, for explanations, for connection to something larger than our brief, fragile mortal lives. The stones stand silent. The symbols carved on them speak a language we've lost. But they speak nonetheless. They say, this mattered. This was sacred. This connected earth to sky, human to cosmos, individual to community, life to death, present to eternity. And in that, in the simple fact that these people cared enough to carve meaning into stone, we find connection. Across 11,000 years, across unimaginable cultural difference. We recognize ourselves, the same questions, the same needs, the same wonder before mystery. The lost religion remains lost, but its monument endures, and that endurance is a kind of testament, a kind of faith made manifest, not in doctrine, but in stone, not in words, but in symbols that still provoke wonder, still invite interpretation, still connect us to people who died 100 centuries ago, but whose spiritual searching was no different than our own. The mystery remains, hidden in symbols we can see but not fully read. Patient as stone, eternal as the questions that drive all human seeking. Around 8200 BCE, something changed. A decision was made. A decision so significant, so final, that it shaped everything that came after. The decision to end Göbekli Tepe, to close it, to bury it beneath the earth and walk away. This wasn't destruction. This wasn't abandonment through collapse or catastrophe. This was deliberate, intentional, almost ritualistic in its care. The enclosures were filled with debris, soil, rocks, animal bones, broken tools, not dumped carelessly, placed, layer by layer. The work required effort, required time, required purpose. Some pillars were carefully laid down before being covered, toppled gently, positioned horizontally, then buried beneath earth and stone. Others were left standing, surrounded by fill material, preserved in their original positions. The effect was to create a mound, a tell, a hill over what had once been a hilltop temple. Why? That's the question that haunts this ending. Why would people who'd invested generations in building these monuments deliberately bury them? Why close what had been, for over 1,000 years, the most important sacred site in the region? The easy answer is that they left, that populations moved, that whatever cultural or religious tradition sustained Göbekli Tepe fragmented or transformed into something else, and there's evidence for this. Later layers at the site, Layer 2 above the buried Layer 3 monuments, show different construction styles. Smaller buildings, rectangular instead of circular, less sophisticated stonework. These might be from different people with different beliefs, but that doesn't fully explain the burial. You could simply abandon a site, let it decay naturally, let weather and time do their work. But burial is active, it's preservation, paradoxically. It protects what it covers. It says, This was important enough to close properly, to seal, to preserve beneath the earth. Perhaps it was religious necessity. Perhaps the rituals performed here had reached their conclusion. Perhaps the purpose these monuments served had been fulfilled. In some religious systems, sacred spaces have lifespans. They're created for specific purposes, maintained for specific periods, then ritually closed when that period ends. The burial might have been the final ceremony, the ultimate offering, returning the site to the earth from which the stones were quarried. Perhaps it was environmental. The climate was changing around 8200 BCE. There's geological evidence for a significant cooling event. The 8.2 kilo-year event, as scientists call it. Temperatures dropped. Rainfall decreased. The abundance that had supported large gatherings might have diminished. The wild herds might have changed their migration patterns. The people might have been forced to adapt, to spread out, to focus more on survival and less on monumental ritual. Perhaps it was agricultural. By 8200 BCE, farming was spreading through the Fertile Crescent. The domestication of wheat and barley was progressing. People were beginning to settle in permanent villages. The old hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the seasonal gatherings, the mobile existence, all of that was changing. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe belonged to the old way. Perhaps as people transitioned to farming, to villages, to a new relationship with the land, the old sacred sites became irrelevant. Or worse, became hindrances, reminders of a past that needed to be left behind. Perhaps it was social. Perhaps the organizational structures that had maintained Göbekli Tepe broke down. Perhaps conflicts arose between groups. Perhaps leadership failed. Perhaps the younger generation simply didn't value what their elders valued. Every culture experiences this. The tension between tradition and innovation, between preserving the old and embracing the new. Perhaps the decision to bury the site was contested. Perhaps some wanted to maintain it. Perhaps others insisted it was time to let go. Or perhaps, and this is darker, perhaps something went wrong. Perhaps the rituals failed to deliver what they promised. Perhaps drought came despite the ceremonies. Perhaps disease struck despite the offerings. Perhaps the faith that had sustained this site for generations crumbled when faced with hardship the monuments couldn't prevent. We don't know. The buried monuments don't explain why they were buried. They just wait beneath the earth, silent, patient, holding their secrets. What we can say is that the burial was thorough, systematic, complete. It took effort, perhaps as much effort as building the site in the first place. Hundreds of people moving soil, placing fill, covering every surface. This wasn't casual. This was commitment to ending, to closing, to ensuring that whatever Göbekli Tepe was, whatever it represented, it was properly concluded. And the burial worked. It preserved the site. For 10,000 years the monuments rested beneath the mound, protected from erosion, from human interference, from the slow degradation that claims unburied stone. The soil shielded the carvings, the fill material prevented collapse. When archaeologists finally excavated, they found structures in remarkably good condition. Better, probably, than if they'd been left exposed. So perhaps we should be grateful. Grateful to whoever made the decision to bury these monuments. Without that act, Göbekli Tepe might have been reduced to rubble. We might never have known it existed. The story might have been completely lost instead of merely hidden. But there's something poignant about it too. Something sad. Imagine being the last person who remembers, the last elder who participated in the rituals when they still held meaning. Watching the younger people fill in the enclosures, watching the pillars disappear beneath earth, knowing that when you die, the knowledge dies with you, the myths, the songs, the prayers, all of it ending, all of it buried along with the stones. That's the fate of most human culture. Most of what we create is lost. Most languages spoken are forgotten. Most songs sung are never heard again. Most stories told vanish with the teller. Permanence is rare. Stone helps, stone endures. But even stone can be buried, forgotten, reduced to mysterious mounds that later people dismiss as natural hills. The silence after burial must have been profound. The hilltop that had buzzed with activity for 1,000 years, suddenly quiet. The pillars that had stood against the sky, suddenly gone, hidden beneath the earth. The gathering place, suddenly empty, returned to wilderness, to grass and wind and the slow passage of seasons unmarked by human ritual. Did people remember? For a while, probably. Grandparents might have told children, "On that hill there used to be a great temple. We used to gather there." But memories fade. Without monuments to anchor them, without writing to preserve them, stories blur into legend, legend into myth, myth into nothing. Within a few generations, probably, no one knew what lay beneath that mound. It was just a hill, an odd one, perhaps. But hills don't require explanation, they just are. And so Göbekli Tepe slept, beneath soil and time and forgetting, the monuments waiting in darkness, the symbols no one could read, the purpose no one remembered, waiting for a shepherd in 1963 to notice something odd, waiting for an archaeologist in 1994 to recognise what he was seeing, waiting for excavation to reveal what burial had preserved. The ending wasn't really an ending, just a pause, a long pause, 10,000 years. But the stones are patient, they can wait. They're still waiting now mostly. 95% of the site remains unexcavated, still buried, still holding secrets, still preserved by the same earth that was meant to hide it forever. The decision to bury was a human decision, fallible, temporary, based on concerns and beliefs we can barely reconstruct. But it worked, it protected, it preserved. And now the monuments emerge again. Not to the world that buried them, that world is gone, completely gone, lost beyond recovery, but to our world, to eyes that can appreciate the achievement without fully understanding the meaning. The burial is part of the story, the silence is part of the mystery, and the patient waiting of stone beneath earth, that's the bridge that connects us across impossible spans of time to people who thought they were ending something but were actually preserving it. For us, for the future they couldn't imagine, for the wonder and questions we bring to their buried temple, now partially revealed, mostly still hidden, eternally mysterious. The question that haunts every researcher, every visitor, every person who contemplates Göbekli Tepe is this: which came first? Did agriculture create the surplus that allowed monument building, or did monument building create the need that drove agriculture? For most of the 20th century the answer seemed obvious. Agriculture came first. It had to. Farming creates surplus. Surplus creates free time. Free time allows specialization. Specialization enables complex projects like temple construction. It's a neat linear progression. Logical. Satisfying in its simplicity. But Göbekli Tepe disrupts that narrative. Completely. Because here's monumental architecture before agriculture. Before permanent villages. Before pottery. Before all the markers we associate with the Neolithic Revolution. The temples came first. The monuments came first. And that simple fact forces us to rethink everything. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe for 2 decades, developed a theory, a radical theory. He suggested that religion, the need to create sacred space, to gather for ritual, to build monuments honouring whatever these people believed in, that this impulse drove the development of agriculture, not the other way around. Think about the logic. Hunter-gatherers gather at Göbekli Tepe. Seasonally, perhaps. Hundreds of people converging on this hilltop. They work on the monuments, they perform rituals, they feast, and they need to eat. Large gatherings require large amounts of food, more than casual foraging can provide, more than opportunistic hunting can supply, so they intensify their harvesting. Wild wheat and barley grow abundantly in this region. They're already collecting it, grinding the seeds into flour, but now they need more. They harvest more intensively. They clear areas to encourage wild grain growth. They notice which plants produce better seeds. They start selecting those seeds, planting them deliberately in areas where they'll grow well. This isn't conscious agriculture. Not at first. It's intensified foraging. But over generations, over centuries, the plants change. Domestication is a gradual process. Wild wheat has brittle stalks. The seeds scatter easily when ripe, ensuring distribution. But some mutants have tougher stalks. The seeds don't scatter. Normally this is a disadvantage. Seeds that don't disperse don't spread. But for humans harvesting, it's perfect. You can collect more seeds from plants that hold on to them. So humans preferentially harvest these mutants and preferentially plant their seeds. Without intending to, without understanding genetics, they're selecting for traits that make plants more useful to humans and less capable of surviving in the wild. They're creating domesticated crops, and the need to feed gatherings at sacred sites is driving the process. Schmidt's theory is elegant. It explains the timeline. It explains why Göbekli Tepe predates agricultural villages. And it suggests something profound, that our spiritual needs, our search for meaning, might be as fundamental to human development as our material needs. That we didn't become civilized and then develop religion. We developed religion and that drove civilization. Others are more skeptical. Some researchers point out that domestication takes time, centuries, maybe millennia. The earliest evidence of domesticated wheat in this region dates to around 10,500 years ago. Göbekli Tepe's earliest construction is 11,600 years ago. That's a 1,000-year gap. Perhaps both were happening simultaneously. Agriculture developing for its own reasons while monuments were being built for theirs. Perhaps the intensification of harvesting was already underway when Göbekli Tepe was built. Perhaps wild grains were already becoming more abundant due to climate change at the end of the Younger Dryas. Perhaps people were already beginning to settle near productive stands of grain. And perhaps the ability to support larger populations in smaller areas made monument building possible, rather than the other way around. Maybe there's no single cause. Maybe it's a feedback loop. Gathering for rituals requires food. Food requirements drive intensified harvesting. Intensified harvesting leads to domestication. Domestication creates surplus. Surplus allows larger gatherings. Larger gatherings require bigger monuments. Bigger monuments require more organization. And around, each element reinforcing the others, driving the transformation from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. What we can say with certainty is that both happened in the same region at roughly the same time. The Fertile Crescent, the arc of land from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and up into southern Anatolia, is where agriculture began. And it's where sites like Göbekli Tepe appear. The two are connected. The question is how. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was a catalyst. Perhaps the social bonds formed through shared labour, through seasonal gatherings, through ritual practice. Perhaps those bonds enabled the cooperation needed for agriculture. Farming is harder than foraging in many ways. It's more work, more risk. You're dependent on specific crops in specific places. If they fail, you can't just move on to the next valley. You've invested too much. But if you have community, if you have networks of mutual support, if you have shared identity created through ritual practice at sacred sites, then the risks of farming become manageable. You can share surplus in good years, receive help in bad years, trust that the community will support you because you're all part of the same sacred project, the same ongoing relationship with the land and the gods and each other. Maybe that's what Göbekli Tepe provided. Not just a temple, but a social technology, a way of creating cohesion across groups that would otherwise be separate, competing, potentially hostile. The shared labour on monuments created obligations, relationships, trust, and that social infrastructure made agriculture possible. Or maybe the causation runs the other way entirely. Maybe early experiments with cultivation, with settling near productive grain stands, created the surplus that allowed people to invest time in monument building. Maybe agriculture came first, quietly, gradually, in ways that don't leave clear archaeological traces. And Göbekli Tepe was an early expression of what that surplus made possible. We may never know for certain. The timeline is fuzzy. The archaeological evidence is incomplete. We've excavated a tiny fraction of the sites from this period, and causation is always tricky. Did A cause B, or did B cause A, or did they co-evolve, mutually reinforcing each other? What's clear is that something extraordinary happened in this region around this time. A transformation, a threshold crossed. Humans had been hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. That lifestyle worked. It was sustainable. It allowed us to spread across the planet, to survive ice ages and climate shifts and all manner of challenges. But then, in the span of a few thousand years, a blink in evolutionary time, we changed. We started farming. We built villages. We created new technologies. We developed new forms of social organization. We went from small mobile bands to large settled communities, from egalitarian groups to hierarchical societies, from oral tradition to written records. Everything changed, and Göbekli Tepe sits at that threshold, at the hinge point, built by hunter-gatherers but pointing towards something new. Old in its methods, stone tools, no pottery, mobile populations, new in its scale and permanence and social complexity. It's a bridge between worlds, a monument to transformation itself. Perhaps that's the most important thing Göbekli Tepe teaches us, that change happens, that humans are capable of reinventing themselves, that the way we've always done things isn't the only way, isn't necessarily the best way, isn't fixed forever. Our ancestors made choices, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps deliberately, that transformed everything. And we're still making those choices, still transforming, still standing at thresholds, wondering what comes next. The theory of religion driving agriculture is beautiful, profound. It suggests that meaning matters, that our spiritual lives aren't separate from our material lives, that the search for connection, for purpose, for something larger than ourselves, that search shapes history as much as technological innovation or environmental pressure. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Maybe the question itself is too simple, looking for a single cause when reality is always more complex, always more tangled, always resisting neat explanations. But the question is worth asking, worth pondering, worth carrying with us as we stand among these ancient stones and feel the weight of deep time, the pull of mystery, the wonder of what our ancestors accomplished and why they did it. The stones don't answer. They never do, but they provoke the asking. And perhaps that's enough. Göbekli Tepe doesn't stand alone. It never did. Even when it was buried and forgotten, even when it was dismissed as a medieval cemetery, it was part of something larger, part of a pattern, part of a moment in human history when monuments appeared, when sacred architecture emerged, when people across a wide region began building in stone. The discoveries keep coming. Karahan Tepe, just 50 kilometers away. Another hilltop, more T-shaped pillars, more circular enclosures, more animal carvings, similar but different, perhaps a sister site, perhaps built by the same culture, maybe even at the same time, perhaps part of a network of sacred places, each serving different groups or different purposes or different aspects of the same belief system. Navali Chori, discovered in the 1990s and sadly flooded by a dam project before it could be fully excavated. But what was found there is striking: stone pillars, T-shaped, carved with animals and symbols. Sound familiar? Navali Chori was built around the same time as Göbekli Tepe. Same culture, same architectural traditions, same spiritual impulses made manifest in stone. Researchers are now using the term Tashtepala, the stone hills, to describe this entire phenomenon. At least a dozen sites have been identified in southeastern Turkey showing similar characteristics. T-shaped pillars, circular or oval enclosures, animal imagery, all dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic, all built by hunter-gatherers or early farmers, all suggesting a shared culture, a shared belief system, a shared commitment to creating sacred space in stone. This isn't just a Turkish phenomenon. Look further afield. Jericho in the Jordan Valley has a massive stone tower dating to around 9000 BCE. What was it for? No one knows. Defense seems unlikely. There's no evidence of warfare. Perhaps ritual, perhaps astronomical. Some researchers suggested aligned to sunset at summer solstice. Perhaps just a demonstration of communal capability, of what people could build when they worked together. Çatalhöyük in central Turkey isn't quite as old. It dates to around 7500 BCE. But it's extraordinary nonetheless. A Neolithic town, densely packed houses, elaborate wall paintings, ritual practices involving bulls and vultures and the burial of the dead beneath house floors. The imagery echoes Göbekli Tepe, the bulls, the vultures, the sense of animals as sacred, as powerful, as worthy of artistic attention. Further west, in Malta, massive stone temples dating to 3600 BCE, much later than Göbekli Tepe, but showing that the impulse to build in stone to create monumental sacred architecture persisted. Malta's temples are different in style, but the commitment is the same. The labour investment, the astronomical alignments, the sense that certain places need to be marked, honoured, made permanent. Stonehenge, of course, built in phases between 3000 and 2000 BCE, again much later, but the continuity is striking. Stone circles, astronomical alignments, gathering places for people who came from across the landscape to participate in rituals we can only imagine. The specifics differ, the cultures are unrelated, but the pattern repeats. What does it mean that humans, independently in different times and places, keep building stone monuments? Keep creating sacred landscapes. Keep aligning stones to celestial events. Is there something about our species, about human consciousness, that drives us toward this kind of expression? Perhaps it's the permanence. Stone endures. Unlike wood, unlike hide, unlike anything else available to ancient peoples, stone lasts. If you want to create something that will outlast you, that will carry meaning forward to generations you'll never meet, you build in stone. You carve your beliefs, your symbols, your sense of what matters into rock, and you trust that even if the meanings are lost, the monuments will remain. Perhaps it's the effort. Perhaps the act of building is itself sacred. The shared labour, the common purpose, the experience of struggling together, succeeding together, creating something none of you could create alone. Maybe the monument is just the excuse. Maybe the community formed through building it is the real goal. Or perhaps, and this is more speculative, perhaps there's something about the transition from mobile to settled life that demands this kind of expression. Hunter-gatherers move. They don't accumulate. They don't build permanent structures because permanence doesn't fit their lifestyle. But when people start settling, when they start investing in specific places, perhaps they need to mark those places, to make them sacred, to justify the choice to stay. Göbekli Tepe fits this pattern. It's at the threshold, built by people who still moved but were beginning to think about staying, beginning to invest in place, beginning to imagine permanence. The monuments express that shift, that new relationship to land, to community, to time itself. Some researchers have suggested connections to myths, to stories of a golden age, a paradise lost, an antediluvian world destroyed by flood or catastrophe. Could Göbekli Tepe be the memory, deeply buried in cultural tradition, of something real? A place of gathering, of abundance, of connection to the sacred, all lost when climate changed, when populations dispersed, when the old ways ended. The 8.2 kiloyear event, that cold snap around 8200 BCE, coincides roughly with Göbekli Tepe's burial. Some have speculated about larger catastrophes. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a comet or asteroid impact around 12,800 years ago, causing rapid climate change, widespread fires, megafauna extinctions. Could that catastrophe be remembered? Could myths of flood, of fire from the sky, of a world destroyed and rebuilt, could these preserve memory of real events? It's possible. Memory persists in strange ways. Stories told and retold can carry information across millennia, even if the details blur, even if the context is lost. The Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions describing coastal landscapes now underwater, flooded when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago. If they can remember for that long, maybe others can too. But we have to be careful. It's easy to see connections that aren't there, to assume that similar myths across cultures must derive from shared historical events rather than shared human psychology. We all fear floods, we all see storms, we all wonder what would happen if the sky fell, if the waters rose, if the world we know ended. Maybe the myths reflect that universal anxiety rather than specific memories. What we can say is that Göbekli Tepe is part of a pattern, a widespread pattern of monument building that emerges at a specific time, the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic, from hunting to farming, from mobile to settled. This transition wasn't simple, wasn't easy, wasn't the same everywhere, but it involved, in many places, the creation of sacred architecture, stone monuments, places of gathering, connections between earth and sky. Perhaps these monuments were anchors, ways of dealing with the anxiety of change. The old ways were ending, the familiar patterns of mobility, of following herds, of seasonal rounds, all shifting. New ways demanded new expressions, new relationships to land, to community, to time. And stone provided that expression, solid, permanent, unchanging even as everything else changed. Göbekli Tepe connects to this broader story. It's not unique. Other sites existed, other monuments were built, but it's special nonetheless. The earliest, the most elaborate, the purest expression of the impulse because it comes before agriculture fully took hold, before villages became the norm, before pottery standardized and writing emerged and all the other developments that would eventually lead to cities and states, and civilization as we know it. Standing at Göbekli Tepe, you're standing at a threshold, not just of this site, but of human history, of the moment when we transformed from one kind of creature into another, when we stopped wandering and started building, when we looked at stone and saw not just material but meaning, when we raised pillars to the sky and said, "This matters. We were here. We believed. We created. Remember us." And we do remember. Not the way they intended, not the meanings they carved or the songs they sang or the beliefs they held, but we remember the fact of them, the achievement, the courage to build something permanent in an impermanent world, the faith that meaning could be preserved in stone even if everything else was lost. The connection spread, through time, through space, through the human impulse to create, to build, to mark the sacred. Göbekli Tepe is one node in that network, one expression of something larger, something that might be fundamental to who we are, who we've always been, who we might always be. The mystery connects us, to each other, to our ancestors, to everyone who's ever stood before stone monuments and wondered what they mean, why they were built, what drove ancient hands to shape rock into meaning. We may never fully understand, but the wondering itself is sacred. The questioning itself is part of the pattern. We build monuments. We wonder about monuments. We connect across time through monuments. And in that connection, perhaps, we find what those ancient builders were seeking. Something larger than ourselves. Something that endures. Something that says we matter. We were here, we reached for eternity, and sometimes, just sometimes, we touched it. The builders are gone, their names lost, their language silent. The songs they sang in those stone circles, the prayers they whispered, the myths they told their children, all vanished. Most of what made them human, most of what gave their lives meaning, exists now only in the traces they left in stone, and yet something survives. Not what they intended to preserve, perhaps, but something. The monuments themselves, obviously, the pillars standing or lying buried, the carvings weathered but still visible, the enclosures traced in stone. These endure because stone endures, because limestone, patient and solid, outlasts everything except time itself. But more than physical objects survive, the achievement survives. The proof that humans 11,600 years ago were capable of complex thought, sophisticated organization, artistic expression, spiritual seeking. That they weren't primitive or simple or less than us in any meaningful way. That they faced the same questions we face. What does it mean to be alive, to be conscious, to die? And tried to answer through building, through gathering, through creating sacred space. That legacy matters. It changes how we see our past. For most of human history, we assume civilization progressed linearly, from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced, from cave-dwelling hunter-gatherers to cities and writing and all the markers we associate with sophistication. Göbekli Tepe disrupts that narrative. It says, complexity came early, monumentality came before agriculture, sacred architecture before practical architecture, the spiritual impulse before the material consolidation. This isn't just academic revision, it's profound reframing. It suggests that what makes us human, the search for meaning, the need for connection to something larger, might be as ancient as language itself, might have been present from the beginning, might have driven development as much as practical needs for food and shelter. The rediscovery in 1994 was archaeological, but it's also cultural, philosophical. It's humanity rediscovering a lost part of ourselves, a capability we'd forgotten we possessed, a chapter of our story we didn't know existed, and the work continues. Even now, today, archaeologists are excavating at Göbekli Tepe, carefully, slowly, using techniques Schmidt couldn't have dreamed of when he started. Ground-penetrating radar mapping structures still buried, 3D laser scanning creating detailed models, DNA analysis of organic remains revealing genetic relationships, diet, health, isotope studies tracking where people came from, what they ate, how they lived. Each discovery raises new questions. Each answer multiplies the mysteries. That's how archaeology works. You never finish. You never reach complete understanding. You just accumulate fragments, piece them together as best you can, and acknowledge that 95% of the story remains buried, waiting for future researchers with better tools and different questions. The site is protected now, UNESCO World Heritage status, shelters built over the excavated enclosures to protect them from weather, guards preventing vandalism, controlled access preventing the damage that tourism can cause. It's a delicate balance, preserving the site while allowing people to experience it, to connect with this ancient achievement, to stand where hunter-gatherers stood 11,000 years ago. Even now, on any given day, you can visit Göbekli Tepe, stand among the pillars, touch the limestone. Though you shouldn't. Though preservation requires distance, the temptation is powerful. See the animal carvings, feel the weight of time, imagine the gatherings that took place here, the rituals, the feasting, the labour, the beliefs that motivated it all. And you're not alone. Thousands of people visit every year, from Turkey, from across the world, archaeologists and tourists and pilgrims of a secular kind, all drawn by the same thing, wonder, the sense of encountering something that shouldn't exist according to our assumptions, something that expands our understanding of human capability, human history, human nature. The other sites in the region, Karahan Tepe, Navali Chori, the dozen or more locations that comprise the Taş Tepeler, culture, they're being excavated too, or prepared for excavation, or mapped and protected for future study. Each one adds details to the picture. Each one confirms that Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader phenomenon, a culture, a way of life, a moment in human history when something new was emerging, when transformation was underway, when the future was being built from stone and vision. The legacy isn't just archaeological, it's entered popular consciousness, books, documentaries, websites, social media. People who've never visited, who never will, still know the name Göbekli Tepe, still recognise its significance, still feel the pull of its mystery. It's become iconic, a symbol of human potential, of what we can accomplish when we work together towards something that matters. Some of the interpretations are wild. Some see evidence of lost advanced civilizations. Others claim extraterrestrial influence. How else could primitive people build this? The answer, of course, is that they weren't primitive. They were us. Same brains, same capabilities, just different circumstances, different knowledge, different tools. But the wild theories reveal something important. People need mystery, need wonder, need to believe that there's more to the world than the mundane, the explainable, the fully understood. Perhaps that's part of the legacy too. Göbekli Tepe serves a function now similar to what it might have served then. It's a sacred space, not in the religious sense necessarily, but in the deeper sense of being set apart, of mattering, of connecting people to something larger than their individual lives. Then it was ritual, now it's archaeology, tourism, education. But the underlying impulse might be the same, the need to mark certain places as special, to gather there, to experience awe. The story continues in scholarship too. Academic debates about dating, about function, about interpretation. Conferences where researchers present findings, argue theories, challenge assumptions. Journals publishing papers that might shift understanding slightly, add one more piece to the puzzle. Graduate students writing dissertations that will add footnotes to footnotes. The slow accretion of knowledge that is science at its best. And the story continues in us. In you, listening now, in everyone who encounters this tale and carries it forward. The builders are gone, but their achievement lives in our awareness of it, in our wonder at it, in our continued asking of the questions they asked. Why are we here? What matters? How do we mark our brief existence in ways that echo beyond our lifetimes? The stars above Göbekli Tepe haven't changed. Not substantially. 11,000 years is nothing to stars. The constellations are the same. The Milky Way still arches overhead. Sirius still blazes in winter. The cosmos that watched the builders' work watches us now. Indifferent. Eternal. Patient beyond human comprehension, but we've changed. Or maybe we haven't. Maybe the builders looking up at those stars felt what we feel. Smallness. Wonder. The vertiginous sense of standing on a planet spinning through space, under lights that have travelled for years or centuries to reach us. Maybe they asked the same questions, got the same silence in response, built monuments anyway, because doing nothing felt worse than acknowledging our insignificance. That continuity is comforting. We're part of a pattern that stretches back tens of thousands of years, building, wondering, seeking, creating meaning from stone and stars and the stubborn insistence that life means something, even if we can't articulate what. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe is not answers, it's questions, better questions, deeper questions, questions that expand rather than constrain, that open rather than close, that invite wonder rather than demanding certainty. What drove people who should have been focused on survival to invest thousands of hours in building monuments? What did they believe that made such effort worthwhile? What did they experience in those stone circles that we've lost? What did they know that we've forgotten? We may never answer these questions fully, but asking them changes us, makes us humble before the achievements of the past, makes us careful about dismissing cultures different from our own, makes us recognize that sophistication takes many forms, that intelligence isn't the same as technology, that meaning can be carved in stone by people without writing or metal or any of the tools we consider essential. The legacy is transformation, of how we see the past, of how we see ourselves, of how we understand the long arc of human development. Before Göbekli Tepe, we thought we knew the story. Agriculture, then villages, then cities, then temples, a clear progression, logical, inevitable. After Göbekli Tepe, the story is more complex, more mysterious, more interesting. Temples before villages, ritual before routine, sacred before secular. Or perhaps all of it intertwined, all of it happening simultaneously, all of it part of the messy, complicated, wonderful process of humans becoming what we are. The hilltop in Turkey still stands, the pillars still rise, the carvings still watch with stone eyes, and every sunrise, every solstice, every moment when celestial patterns align, the site still performs its function, still marks time, still connects earth to sky, still proves that stone carved with purpose can outlast everything except wonder. We carry the legacy forward, not perfectly, not completely, but we carry it, in our knowledge of the site, in our continued excavation, in our wonder at what was accomplished, in our recognition that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were us, fully human, fully capable, fully engaged in the same search for meaning that occupies us still. The story doesn't end, it continues, in stone and scholarship, in mystery and meaning, in the questions we ask, and the wonder we feel. The builders are gone, but what they built remains, and as long as it remains, as long as we remember to look, to wonder, to ask, the legacy lives. The stars watch, the stone remembers, and somewhere between starlight and limestone, between ancient hands and modern eyes, the connection holds. Fragile, precious, eternal, and so we return. Back to this moment, back to wherever you are, listening to this now, back to the present, which is all any of us truly inhabit. The hilltop in southeastern Turkey still stands, right now, tonight, under the same stars that watched its construction. The limestone glows faintly if there's moonlight. The enclosures rest in darkness. The pillars, those that remain standing, rise silent against the sky. The carvings are invisible in the night, but they're there. The fox still prowls across stone, the vulture still spreads its wings, the scorpion's tail still curves in that ancient threatening gesture. The wind moves across the site the way it always has, carrying dust, carrying the scent of dry grass, carrying nothing of the past except what the stones themselves remember. It doesn't know about the gatherings that once happened here, doesn't care about the rituals, the feasting, the labour. It just moves, patient and mindless, the way wind has moved since before there were minds to notice it. 11,600 years. That's how long the stones have been here, how long they've stood or lain buried, how long they've waited through empires rising and falling, through languages being born and dying, through the whole long, strange journey from hunter-gatherers to cities to you, listening now, connected to those ancient builders through nothing but curiosity and wonder, and the stones that endured. Take a breath. Feel whatever's around you. The weight of the evening, the surface beneath you, the particular quality of this night, this moment, this single point in time that will never come again. You're here. Now. The same way those ancient people were here then. Different times, different circumstances, but the same fundamental fact of being alive, being conscious, being briefly aware before the darkness claims us all. We don't know what they believed. We've accepted that by now. The meanings are lost. The songs are silent. The prayers spoken in those stone circles were never written down, never recorded, never passed forward. They existed once, as real as anything that exists, and then they were gone, completely gone, lost beyond recovery, but the stones remain, patient witnesses to what cannot be spoken. They don't explain themselves. They don't offer answers. They just stand, or lie buried, waiting, holding the shape they were given 11,000 years ago, holding the space where meaning once lived. Even if the specific meaning is gone, perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the endurance itself is the message, that what we build with care and purpose and devotion can outlast us, can outlast our cultures, our languages, our beliefs, can speak to people we could never have imagined, in times we could never have conceived, saying not, this is what we meant, but simply, we were here, we tried, we built something that mattered. The mystery remains. We've solved some things. We know when Göbekli Tepe was built. We know roughly how. We know who built it, hunter-gatherers, people without agriculture or pottery or metal. We know it was deliberately buried. We know it's part of a larger pattern of monument building across the region. But the why, the deep why, the human why, that stays hidden, that waits in the silence between the pillars, in the space where chanting once echoed, in the carved eyes of stone animals that watch without seeing, remember without knowing, and perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps some things are meant to remain mysterious. Perhaps the wonder itself is sacred. Perhaps approaching these stones with questions rather than answers is more honest, more humble, more true to what they are and what they've always been. The stars above the site are the same stars, barely shifted in their positions. The constellations the builders knew still wheel overhead. Orion still hunts. The Pleiades still cluster. The Milky Way still flows like a river of light across the darkness. If you could stand at Göbekli Tepe tonight, if you could look up from that hilltop, you'd see what they saw. The same patterns, the same distant fires, the same infinite depths. That continuity is profound. The cosmos doesn't care about human concerns, doesn't notice our monuments or mourn our forgetting. It just continues. Stars burning, planets orbiting, the great slow dance of matter and energy that will continue long after every human-made thing has crumbled to dust. And yet, we matter. We must matter. Because we're the ones who notice, the ones who wonder, the ones who build monuments and ask questions and try to connect temporary existence to something eternal. The stars don't care, but we do. And our caring, our wondering, our building, that's what makes us human. Göbekli Tepe proved something important. It proved that this impulse, this need for meaning, for connection, for creating something larger than ourselves, is ancient, is fundamental, has been part of us for at least 11,000 years, probably far longer. We've always been this way, wondering, building, seeking. Rest now. Let the wondering settle into stillness. Let the questions rest unanswered. Let the mystery be mysterious. Somewhere in Turkey the stones wait, most still buried, still holding secrets, still patient. They've waited this long. They can wait longer. They have nothing but time. The wind continues. The stars wheel slowly. The darkness holds everything. The past, the present, the future, all existing simultaneously in the patient now of stone and sky. And in that stillness, in that ongoing silence, the builders somehow persist, not as ghosts, not as memories we can clearly recall, but as presence, as the fact of their achievement, as the proof that humans have always reached for something beyond mere survival, have always asked why, have always built monuments to questions that have no answers. The hilltop rests, the limestone cools, the night deepens, and somewhere, always, the stones remember. What they remember, we may never know, but they remember. Patient, silent, eternal. The mystery endures. The wonder continues. If tonight brought you peace, if the stones spoke to you across those 11,000 years, consider subscribing. Your presence here matters. And we, brief as we are part of it. Connected across time to everyone who's ever stood before something ancient, and felt the pull of questions older than answers. The stones stand, the stars watch, the silence holds, and in that holding there is peace.